The crystal chandelier cast a harsh glare over the roasted turkey, and the 20 guests gathered around the mahogany table. Cordelia, my mother-in-law, stood at the head, her collarbones heavy with diamonds purchased using stolen charity funds. She glared down at my 8-year-old son, Leo. He had accidentally bumped her wineglass, spilling a single drop of Cabernet onto the white linen. Before I could intercept, Cordelia lunged. Her open palm struck Leo's cheek with a sickening crack. He hit the polished hardwood, gasping for air. Cordelia loomed over him. "He is not real family. Get out!" she shrieked. I looked at Trent, my husband, waiting for him to shield his stepson. Instead, he lifted his crystal tumbler and took a slow sip of bourbon. The dining room fell dead silent. 20 faces turned toward me, anticipating a weeping mother grabbing her child to flee. I did not shed a tear. I wiped a speck of dust from my lapel, locked eyes with the woman who struck my child, and delivered 6 words. "Your offshore accounts are completely frozen." Cordelia dropped her porcelain plate. It shattered across the floor. The room stopped breathing, entirely oblivious to the federal tactical team currently breaching the perimeter of the estate. Have you ever had to permanently dismantle a toxic relative who believed you were powerless? Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and hit subscribe to see exactly how this trap snapped shut. To understand the sheer arrogance of that Thanksgiving execution, I have to take you back exactly 3 months. For 3 years, I played the role of the quiet, compliant wife. I faded into the wallpaper, maintaining a steady, unremarkable presence while Trent and his mother, Cordelia, consumed the oxygen in every room they entered. They operated the Vanguard Hope Foundation, a children's charity that served primarily as a vanity project to launder their social standing. Cordelia held the title of president, while Trent served as executive director. Together, they orchestrated a masterclass in superficial philanthropy. I watched them operate at an August fundraising luncheon. Cordelia stood near the entrance of the country club ballroom, draped in heavy silk, extending her hand to wealthy donors. She did not converse. She held court. Trent flanked her, adjusting the cuffs of a bespoke charcoal suit, flashing brilliant, hollow smiles. He spoke loudly about their superior breeding, weaving tales of their ancestors arriving on the Mayflower, ensuring every local politician within earshot understood his elite pedigree. They treated me with thinly veiled disgust. To Trent and Cordelia, I was a social charity case. They swallowed my cover story without a single question, entirely convinced I was merely a mid-level data clerk for a generic government contractor. Cordelia routinely handed me her empty champagne flutes, treating me more like a hired caterer than a daughter-in-law. Trent mocked my inexpensive cardigans and sensible shoes, shaking his head at my apparent lack of ambition. They had absolutely no idea who I actually was. I did not file basic paperwork. I was a senior digital forensics auditor for the Department of the Treasury. I spent my days penetrating encrypted networks, dismantling shell corporations, and tracing illicit funds for federal task forces. Furthermore, I possessed a family trust fund that eclipsed the entire operating budget of their foundation. I hid my career and my wealth behind a carefully constructed facade for one specific reason, Leo. My 8-year-old son lost his biological father when he was just a toddler. When I married Trent 3 years ago, I wanted to provide Leo with a stable, grounded home. I knew the toxic, corrosive nature of unearned wealth. I saw how elitism had warped Trent and his sister, Sloane, into arrogant narcissists. I refused to let my son grow up believing his worth was tied to a designer label or a country club membership. So, I hid the money. I drove a modest sedan, clipped coupons, and lived the life of a working-class mother. But my attempt to shield Leo only exposed him to a different kind of poison. Trent and Cordelia created a suffocating environment, actively alienating my son because he lacked their precious bloodline. The exclusion was not loud. It was executed through 1,000 quiet, deliberate cuts. During a Sunday brunch at Cordelia's sprawling estate, Leo sat at the kitchen island, quietly coloring a picture he had drawn for Trent. Cordelia glided into the room, holding 2 brightly wrapped gifts for Sloane's children, who were playing in the garden. She walked right past Leo, completely ignoring his polite greeting. Trent walked in moments later. Leo held up his drawing, his small face beaming with pride. Trent barely glanced at the paper. He patted Leo on the head with stiff, obligatory detachment, then turned his back to pour a cup of espresso. Later that afternoon, Cordelia hired a professional photographer to take family portraits on the manicured lawn. When I guided Leo toward the group, Cordelia held up a manicured hand, stopping us in our tracks. "Just the core bloodline for this shot. Willow," she dictated, her voice smooth but laced with venom. "We want to preserve the family legacy. You and the boy can step aside." I looked down at Leo. He lowered his head, his small shoulders slumping as he absorbed the rejection. I squeezed his hand, swallowing the instinct to tear the manicured lawn apart. I smiled politely, stepped out of the frame, and let them pose in their hollow arrogance. I accepted the humiliation to keep the peace, recording every slight, every insult, and every dismissal in the steel vault of my mind. Their elitism was infuriating, but their financial hypocrisy was what finally awakened my professional instincts. Trent and Cordelia projected an image of staggering wealth, yet Trent constantly complained about the charity's struggling metrics. He would sit at our kitchen table, rubbing his temples, lamenting the drop in donor retention and the rising costs of their outreach programs. He claimed the foundation was barely scraping by. I listened to his complaints while observing the physical evidence surrounding me. The math simply did not align. Trent drove a leased European sports car that commanded a monthly payment higher than an average mortgage. He wore limited edition platinum watches and cycled through tailor-made suits that cost thousands of dollars apiece. Cordelia was even worse. She carried authentic crocodile skin handbags and frequently traveled to exclusive wellness retreats in Switzerland, all while claiming she drew a nominal salary from the charity. Sloane, Trent's younger sister, contributed nothing to society, yet she lived in a luxury downtown penthouse and rotated through a fleet of expensive vehicles. She officially held a vague consulting title within the foundation, a position that required zero actual work. My forensic instincts, honed by years of hunting federal tax evaders, began to whisper. People who ran struggling nonprofit organizations did not wear red-soled designer shoes to casual family dinners. Men who stressed over plummeting donation metrics did not casually purchase vintage scotch that cost $2,000 a bottle. I started paying closer attention. I observed Trent tossing mail onto the counter. I noted the logos of boutique offshore banking institutions on the envelopes before he quickly snatched them away. I watched Cordelia write personal checks for lavish estate renovations, pulling from accounts that bore names completely unrelated to her personal trust. I was a woman trained to find anomalies in perfectly balanced ledgers. For 3 years, I had deliberately turned off my analytical mind at home, wanting nothing more than a normal, quiet life. But as Trent ignored my son, and Cordelia flaunted her stolen diamonds, the dormant auditor inside me woke up. One evening in early September, I visited the Vanguard Hope Foundation headquarters to drop off Trent's forgotten briefcase. The office occupied a premium floor in a high-rise downtown, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass walls, imported Italian marble reception desks, and modern art pieces hanging in the corridors. For an organization allegedly dedicated to funding inner-city youth programs, the overhead costs were astronomically absurd. I walked past the executive suites. I saw Sloane sitting at her desk, aggressively scrolling through a luxury travel website while ignoring a stack of grant applications. I saw Trent in his glass-walled office, laughing loudly on the phone, his feet propped up on a mahogany desk. He wore a brand-new pair of Italian loafers. When I handed him the briefcase, he did not thank me. He snatched the leather handle, checked his platinum watch, and dismissed me with a wave of his hand, complaining that my presence interrupted his workflow. I walked back to my modest sedan parked in the subterranean garage. I sat behind the steering wheel and stared at the dashboard. My mind shifted gears, dropping the persona of the submissive wife and engaging the lethal precision of a treasury auditor. I ran a preliminary mental calculation: the rent for the commercial real estate, the leased luxury vehicles, the bespoke wardrobes, the Swiss vacations, and the sprawling estates. The sheer volume of outgoing capital required to sustain their aristocratic cosplay was massive. They were burning through millions of dollars. Charities of their size filed public tax documents. I knew exactly what Vanguard Hope claimed to earn, and I knew exactly what they claimed to disperse. The chasm between their public filings and their private lifestyle was a glaring, gaping hole. Trent and Cordelia were not just arrogant snobs protecting a hollow legacy. They were actively bleeding their own foundation dry. They were taking money donated to vulnerable children and feeding it directly into their insatiable egos. The coiled spring inside my chest locked into place. I turned the ignition key, the engine humming quietly to life. I drove out of the garage, leaving their glass tower behind. I had endured 3 years of disrespect. I had watched my son absorb their elitist cruelty. I had swallowed my pride to keep a fractured family together. That era was officially over. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I would not just leave Trent. A simple divorce would allow them to maintain their fake prestige. It would allow Cordelia to spin a narrative of my failure. I decided right then and there to audit my own family. I would peel back the layers of their fake empire, expose the rot underneath, and watch the federal government burn their aristocratic facade to ash. To conceal a massive financial crime, a perpetrator must ensure their closest observers doubt their own reality. Trent understood this principle, deploying psychological warfare with textbook narcissism. He recognized that a wife asking questions about bank statements posed a severe threat to his operation. To neutralize me, he needed to break my mind. The campaign began subtly in early September. Trent started returning home at 2 a.m, smelling of aviation fuel, expensive gin, and hotel soap. When I asked about his late hours, he did not apologize or offer excuses. He went on the offensive. One evening, I sat at the kitchen island holding my tablet. A notification had flashed on our joint account, a $4,000 charge at an exclusive downtown steakhouse. When Trent walked through the door, dropping his briefcase onto the entryway bench, I turned the screen toward him. I asked him why a struggling charity director was spending $4,000 on a single Tuesday dinner. Trent did not flinch. He walked over, poured a glass of sparkling water, and looked at me with a mask of manufactured pity. He reached out and gently pushed the tablet down against the marble counter. "I told you about the donor summit last week, Willow," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I explicitly laid out the entire budget for that dinner. Are you losing your memory again?" I stared at him, my brow furrowing. "You never mentioned a donor summit. You told me you were working late in the office to review grant proposals?" Trent sighed, a heavy, theatrical sound. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, playing the part of an exhausted, long-suffering husband. "You are completely paranoid. Your data entry job is clearly stressing you out. You spend all day staring at spreadsheets. And now you are bringing that obsessive paranoia into our home. You need to get your grip on reality. Willow." He deployed that tactic relentlessly. Whenever I questioned exorbitant charges or missing blocks of time, he projected his guilt directly onto my sanity. The warfare escalated from financial gaslighting to active sabotage. I would leave my car keys on the kitchen counter an hour later. They would vanish. I would find them hidden inside a drawer in the guest bathroom. When I panicked, tearing the house apart to get Leo to school on time, Trent would lean against the doorframe, shaking his head. He would whisper about my cognitive decline, suggesting I needed severe psychiatric intervention. He moved to isolate me from my support system. One Saturday, I left my phone on the nightstand while I took a shower. Trent bypassed my simple lock screen. He opened a text thread with my oldest friend and canceled our upcoming weekend trip. He typed a frantic, erratic message claiming I was suffering from a severe mental breakdown and needed complete isolation. When my friend stopped calling, confused and hurt by the bizarre messages, I asked Trent if he knew why she had gone silent. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, looking down at me with feigned sorrow. "Your erratic behavior is exhausting, Willow," he whispered. "You are driving people away. I am the only one who can handle your instability right now. You need to trust me." He wanted me weak, isolated, and entirely dependent on his version of reality. He believed he was systematically dismantling my intellect. I did not fight him. A federal auditor knows that interrupting a suspect alters their behavior and drives their crimes deeper underground. To map his network, I needed him to feel invincible. So, I played my part. I slumped my shoulders. I let my hands tremble when I poured his morning coffee. I whispered fake, tearful apologies into his chest, begging him to forgive my failing memory. I even started leaving sticky notes around the house to remind myself of basic tasks, providing him with physical props to validate his narrative of my declining mental health. He smirked over my head when he hugged me, utterly convinced his smokescreen was impenetrable. But the charade shattered completely in mid-October. I was gathering laundry from our bedroom. Trent had discarded his tailored charcoal suit over the back of an armchair after returning from a multi-city fundraising tour. I picked up the jacket to prep it for the dry cleaner as I smoothed the lapels. My fingers brushed against a thick, stiff piece of paper wedged deep inside the inner breast pocket. I pulled it out. It was a receipt folded into a tight, crisp square. I unfolded the premium paper. The ink stamped at the top displayed the logo of a legendary jewelry boutique located on the Champs-Élysées in Paris. I scanned the lines. The purchase date aligned with the previous week. The item description read platinum and diamond tennis necklace. The total printed at the bottom, $15,000. The payment method listed a corporate credit card ending in 4 digits that matched none of our joint or personal accounts. I stood in the center of the bedroom holding the receipt. A normal wife might have collapsed onto the edge of the mattress, weeping over the undeniable proof of infidelity. I did not shed a single tear. The fragile, paranoid persona I had worn for weeks evaporated instantly. A glacial, terrifying clarity washed over me. I walked straight into my home office, locked the heavy oak door, and booted up my encrypted workstation. I bypassed the standard browsers, utilizing a secure virtual private network to mask my digital footprint. I pulled up the Vanguard Hope Foundation's public social media feeds and cross-referenced them with Trent's official corporate itinerary. The Paris fundraising gala took place exactly 12 days prior. I scanned the high-resolution photographs uploaded by the foundation's marketing team. I scrolled past images of Cordelia mingling with European aristocrats. I stopped on a candid shot taken near the grand staircase of the venue. There stood Trent, holding a crystal champagne flute, flashing his hollow, charismatic smile. Standing directly beside him, her hand resting intimately on his forearm, was Paige. Paige was the 26-year-old event coordinator for the charity. I recalled her face vividly. She wore heavy, suffocating perfume. During a foundation mixer a month prior, she had deliberately bumped into my shoulder, spilling a drop of water onto my inexpensive cardigan. She had smirked, offering a condescending, insincere apology, looking me up and down with absolute disdain. I remembered noting that the silk blouse she wore that evening cost more than a month of her legitimate salary. I zoomed in on the photograph from Paris. The resolution sharpened, bringing Paige's features into crisp focus. Resting against her collarbone, catching the light of the venue's chandeliers, was a brand new, gleaming platinum and diamond tennis necklace. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a deafening, metallic click. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the glowing monitors. I did not feel heartbreak. I felt the cold, thrilling pulse of a hunter locking onto her prey. Trent was not just a cheating husband buying expensive gifts for a mistress. A man pulling a legitimate non-profit salary does not purchase $15,000 diamond necklaces in Paris on a whim. He certainly does not pay for them using a ghost corporate credit card. The $15,000 was a glaring, sloppy anomaly. The affair was merely a symptom of a much larger, darker disease. The pieces of his strategy finally aligned. Trent was utilizing the gaslighting and the psychological warfare as a calculated legal defense mechanism. He needed me unstable, questioning my own reality, and documented as a paranoid hysteric. He was building a narrative so that if I ever stumbled upon the missing charity millions, my testimony would be completely discredited by any court or federal investigator. He was creating the ultimate smokescreen to protect a massive financial operation. But his arrogance bred extreme carelessness. Leaving a physical receipt for stolen assets inside a suit pocket was the mark of a greedy, sloppy amateur playing a very dangerous game. I folded the receipt back into a tight square and slipped it into the pocket of my trousers. Trent believed he was a master manipulator navigating a board full of pawns. He failed to realize he had just invited a senior Treasury auditor to examine his books. The investigation was officially open, and I was going to rip his entire universe apart. The digital clock on the nightstand shifted to 2 o'clock in the morning. A pale sliver of moonlight cut through the plantation shutters, casting long, barred shadows across the duvet. I lay perfectly still on my side of the California King mattress, regulating my breathing into a slow, rhythmic cadence beside me. Trent exhaled a deep, heavy sigh, his chest rising and falling in the absolute ignorance of a deep slumber. He slept with the unbothered arrogance of a man who believed his psychological subjugation had succeeded. He thought he shared a bed with a paranoid, fractured woman. He failed to realize he was sleeping next to an active tripwire. I pushed the heavy duvet down, swinging my legs over the edge of the mattress. My bare feet met the freezing surface of the polished hardwood floor. I did not reach for a robe. I moved through the darkness with the silent, practiced grace of a shadow, slipping out of the master bedroom and pulling the door shut until the latch clicked without a single sound. I walked down the long corridor to my home office. I stepped inside, secured the heavy deadbolt, and flipped a switch beneath my desk. The ambient lighting remained off, but my workstation surged to life. 3 curved monitors illuminated the dark room, bathing my face in a harsh, cold blue glow. I sank into my ergonomic chair and cracked my knuckles. The fragile, trembling wife remained outside in the hallway. The woman sitting at this desk was a senior digital forensics auditor, a predator returning to her natural hunting ground. Trent possessed a lethal combination of corporate greed and technological incompetence. He assumed that conducting his illicit business from the comfort of our suburban estate offered him an invisible shield. He believed our home router was a private, impenetrable fortress. He fundamentally misunderstood the architecture of digital networks. I launched a proprietary network analyzer, a tool I utilize daily to crack the encrypted communications of federal tax evaders. I bypassed the superficial security of our home router in less than 40 seconds. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, typing rapid sequences of command prompts that commanded the router to dump its cached traffic logs from the past 90 days. Lines of raw, unformatted data cascaded down my primary monitor like a digital waterfall. I deployed a sorting algorithm to filter the noise, isolating the specific media access control address associated with Trent's personal laptop. The screen blinked, stabilizing into a neat, chronological ledger of his private web traffic. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the uniform resource locators. Trent maintained decent operational security on the surface, utilizing a commercial virtual private network to obscure his browsing. However, amateur criminals always leave a backdoor open out of sheer convenience. He routinely logged into his virtual private network directly through his standard browser, allowing his device to handshake with the router before the encryption tunnel fully established itself. That microsecond of exposure was all the leverage I required. I isolated the destination servers he contacted most frequently during the hours between midnight and 4 o'clock in the morning. 2 specific Internet Protocol addresses flagged immediately. I ran a reverse domain lookup. The servers did not belong to the Vanguard Hope Foundation, nor did they trace back to his public domestic bank. The addresses resolved to a boutique, heavily fortified wealth management portal hosted on servers located in the Cayman Islands. Trent was hiding money offshore. I accessed the login terminal for the clandestine banking portal. The screen presented a sleek, minimalist interface demanding a username and a passphrase. Trent viewed himself as a mastermind, but his ego rendered him entirely predictable. Narcissists anchor their security to their own past glories. I bypassed brute force hacking methods. I typed in the name of his college rowing crew, followed by the year he secured the regional championship, substituting specific letters for special characters. The terminal rejected the first attempt. I adjusted the syntax, capitalizing the team name and adding the founding year of the Vanguard Hope Foundation. I struck the Enter key. The security firewall dissolved. A progress bar flashed across the screen, confirming authorization. The primary dashboard of his shadow account materialized in high definition. The breath caught in the back of my throat. I stared at the aggregate balance displayed in the upper right corner. This was not a slush fund reserved for buying a mistress $15,000 tennis necklaces. This was a sprawling, subterranean empire of wealth. I immediately initiated a mass data extraction protocol. I exported the entire transaction history, the routing numbers, the wire transfer receipts, and the recipient ledgers into a secure, encrypted spreadsheet on my local drive. I severed the connection to the offshore portal, ensuring my intrusion left 0 digital fingerprints, and turned my full attention to the raw data. I executed a series of pivot tables, commanding my software to categorize the expenditures and trace the incoming capital. The resulting flowchart painted a masterpiece of high-level corporate treason. Trent was not skimming from the charity's petty cash. He was executing a massive, coordinated federal embezzlement scheme right under the noses of the board of directors. The architecture of his fraud was remarkably brazen. I mapped the incoming wire transfers depositing into the Cayman account. The funds originated from 3 distinct corporate entities: Apex Logistical Solutions, Summit Event Management, and Horizon Outreach Group. I opened a secondary window, querying the Federal Business Registry database. I punched in the names of the 3 companies. The search results populated instantly. All 3 entities were registered as limited liability corporations in the state of Delaware. Utilizing the exact same registered agent address, they possess no physical storefronts, no active employees, and no legitimate operating history. They were ghost corporations, empty shells constructed entirely of paper and lies. I cross-referenced the names of these shell companies against the Vanguard Hope Foundation's public tax filings from the previous 2 years. The sheer audacity of the crime locked my jaw. Vanguard Hope listed Apex, Summit, and Horizon as their primary third-party vendors. Trent was generating fabricated invoices for charity event logistics, marketing outreach, and venue management. He submitted these phantom invoices to the foundation. Because Cordelia controlled the board and Trent controlled the executive finances, they approved the payouts without a single layer of independent oversight. They were funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations, money intended for underprivileged children and community development, directly into their Delaware shell companies. From Delaware, the funds were immediately scrubbed and wire transferred into Trent's offshore Cayman account. I tracked the flow of the stolen capital over a span of 36 months. The frequency of the transfers accelerated over time. What started as modest payouts of $20,000 had ballooned into massive, brazen extractions exceeding $150,000 per quarter. I tapped my index finger against the glass surface of my desk. A scheme of this magnitude required an internal accomplice to handle the procurement paperwork. Trent could sign the executive approvals, but generating the sheer volume of fabricated logistical invoices required someone managing the ground-level operations of the charity. I pulled up the specific vendor contracts Trent had scanned and archived in his hidden drive. I zoomed in on the signature lines located at the bottom of the procurement requests. The ink displayed a looping, stylized signature page. The 26-year-old event coordinator was not merely a mistress reaping the benefits of stolen diamonds and European vacations. She was actively generating the fraudulent paperwork. She was the operational linchpin, securing the fake invoices that allowed Trent to bleed the charity dry. The scope of their collusion settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. My husband, my mother-in-law, and the mistress were operating a unified criminal syndicate. They paraded around country clubs, lecturing the public on philanthropy and bleeding heart generosity, while systematically robbing the very communities they pledged to serve. They funded their leased luxury cars, their bespoke suits, and their Swiss wellness retreats using stolen charity capital, all while mocking my inexpensive cardigans and alienating my 8-year-old son. I sat back in my ergonomic chair. The cool air of the home office washed over my face. The sting of the infidelity entirely vanished, eclipsed by the sheer gravity of the federal crimes glaring from my monitors. Trent thought he was a mastermind controlling an oblivious, deteriorating wife. He thought his gaslighting had effectively neutralized any threat I posed. Instead, his sloppy arrogance had handed a fully verified, undeniable audit directly to a Treasury investigator. I highlighted the master ledger on my screen. I did not intend to simply file for divorce. Walking away would leave their false aristocratic prestige entirely intact. It would allow Cordelia to twist the narrative, branding me a failure while they continued to steal. I reached for an encrypted flash drive, inserting the metal casing into the port of my terminal. I transferred the entirety of the stolen data, the Delaware registration codes, the forged invoices, Page's signatures, and the Cayman routing numbers onto the drive. My finger hovered over the workstation, still touching the cold metal casing of the flash drive slotted into the port. The investigation was no longer an observation. I shifted my mindset from auditor to executioner. But before I severed the link, my instincts whispered that this shallow layer of greed was only the beginning. I prepared to dig deeper, ready to search the final, darkest corners of his digital vault and weave the rope they would ultimately use to hang themselves. The encrypted flash drive remained locked in the terminal, silently drinking in the evidence of their corporate theft. A standard investigator might have pulled the drive right then, satisfied with the massive cache of master ledgers and offshore routing numbers. But I am not a standard investigator. I hunt financial predators who construct labyrinths to hide their crimes. A predator like Trent would never leave his primary vulnerability completely unshielded. He would engineer a contingency plan. Rather than severing the connection, I bypassed the main directories containing the offshore ledgers and initiated a deep sector scan of the original Cayman Island server root drive. I commanded my software to search for fragmented files, unallocated space, and hidden partitions. The scan ran for 3 agonizing minutes. The progress bar crawled across my center monitor, illuminating the dark office. A sharp chime broke the silence. The terminal flagged a segregated, heavily encrypted subdirectory buried beneath layers of decoy system files. The folder bore no title, represented only by a string of alphanumeric characters. Trent utilized military-grade encryption for this specific partition, far surpassing the amateur security he applied to his banking portal. He intended for this folder to remain entirely invisible. I leaned forward, my pulse steadying into a slow, rhythmic drum against my ribs. I deployed a proprietary decryption algorithm, a specialized tool I utilized to dismantle the digital fortresses of hostile state actors. My screens cascaded with rapid lines of green code as the software battered the firewall, testing millions of cryptographic combinations per second. The mechanical hum of my laptop fan accelerated, struggling to cool the processor under the immense load. I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked on the monitor, waiting for the defense mechanism to break. 10 minutes later, the encryption shattered, the folder unzipped, dumping its contents onto my desktop. I opened the first file. It was a scanned portable document format containing the official articles of incorporation for Apex Logistical Solutions, one of the Delaware shell companies draining the charity. I scanned the document, my eyes tracking down to the registered agent section. The breath caught sharply in my throat, snagging on a jagged hook of pure disbelief. Trent's name did not appear on the document. Cordelia's name was entirely absent. Page's loopy signature was nowhere to be found. The registered agent listed on the federal filing was me. My full legal name, my date of birth, and my social security number sat neatly typed in the registration blocks. I opened the subsequent files. The incorporation documents for Summit Event Management and Horizon Outreach Group displayed the exact same data. Trent had mapped my identity to every single phantom corporation bleeding the Vanguard Hope Foundation. I extracted the metadata from the scanned documents. Trent had not simply typed my name. He had executed a flawless digital forgery. He had scanned my physical driver's license, harvested my digital signature from our joint tax returns, and superimposed them onto the offshore banking authorizations. He even spoofed my device's media access control address, routing the initial shell company formations through a server that mirrored my home office internet protocol address. He manufactured a digital trail designed to withstand a standard federal audit. He constructed a paper reality where I was the sole mastermind behind the entire criminal syndicate. I opened the master balance sheet housed inside the contingency folder. The true scale of his operation materialized. He had not just skimmed a few $100,000 for lavish trips and diamond necklaces. The ledger stretched back to the very first month we were married. The total stolen capital, accumulating compound interest in the Cayman accounts, glared back at me in bold red text. $5 million. Trent and Cordelia had stolen $5 million from underprivileged children, and they had surgically anchored the entire theft directly to my neck. My hands dropped from the keyboard. The sheer sociopathic calculation of his betrayal defied basic human comprehension. He did not just want to cheat on me with a 26-year-old secretary. He did not just want to steal from his own foundation. He planned to sacrifice me to the federal government. I opened the final subfolder. It contained an Outlook data file filled with unsent email drafts. I clicked the first draft. The recipient line addressed the White-Collar Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I read Trent's words. He adopted the tone of a heartbroken, terrified husband and a dutiful corporate executive. He detailed how he had recently uncovered alarming financial discrepancies within the Vanguard Hope Foundation. He claimed he hired a private investigator who traced the missing $5 million to a series of Delaware shell companies controlled entirely by his wife. I continued reading, the blood turning to ice in my veins. Trent's draft explicitly referenced the psychological gaslighting he had inflicted upon me for months. He wrote that his wife had been exhibiting severe paranoia, memory loss, and erratic behavior. He claimed my mental instability finally made sense in the context of a massive federal crime. He cited the canceled appointments, the misplaced keys, and the sticky notes I left around the house as proof of a guilty conscience crumbling under pressure. He weaponized my compliance. He weaponized the fragile persona I adopted to keep the peace. He wove every fake apology I gave him into a tapestry of my own guilt. I clicked the second email draft. The recipient was a high-powered divorce attorney in downtown Chicago. Trent outlined his strategy to file for an emergency asset seizure. He instructed the attorney to freeze all of our marital accounts the moment the federal indictment hit my name. He claimed he needed to protect his assets from government forfeiture by declaring me an unfit, unstable criminal facing decades behind bars. He guaranteed he would secure full control of my personal estate. He intended to strip me of everything I owned, hand me over to federal prosecutors for a $5 million wire fraud conviction, and leave me rotting in a penitentiary. He would play the tragic victim, clear his name with the charity board, and walk away with the Cayman Island millions alongside his young mistress. The blueprint for my absolute destruction sat glaring on the monitors. I pushed my chair back from the desk. The air in the room felt thin, suffocatingly cold. Any remaining trace of mercy, any lingering loyalty I held for the man sleeping down the hall, evaporated into the sterile glow of the screens. I did not weep for my dead marriage. I did not panic at the sight of the federal trap closing around me. A lesser woman would have screamed. She would have marched into the master bedroom, shaken her husband awake, and demanded answers. She would have shown her hand, giving him the opportunity to destroy the hard drives and accelerate his timeline. I operate in the silent spaces where arrogant men leave themselves exposed. I reached out and extracted the encrypted flash drive from the port. I slid it into the pocket of my trousers. I wiped the terminal cache, scrubbed the access logs from the router, and executed a secure shutdown of my workstation. The monitors clicked off, plunging the office back into absolute darkness. Trent believed he played a flawless game of chess. He believed he manipulated a naive data entry clerk into taking the fall for his $5 million heist. He failed to comprehend the apex predator he had invited into his home. I walked out of the office, securing the deadbolt behind me. I padded silently down the dark hallway, returning to the master bedroom. The pale moonlight still cast long shadows across the floor. Trent remained exactly as I had left him, snoring softly, his chest rising and falling in peaceful ignorance. I stood at the edge of the mattress, looking down at his face. I studied the relaxed slope of his jaw, the expensive silk of his pajamas. I did not see a husband. I saw a target. He wanted a war of digital forensics. He wanted to use my identity to secure his freedom. I slipped beneath the heavy duvet, resting my head against the pillow. I stared at the ceiling, my mind already mapping the precise architecture of the counterstrike. I would not just arrest him. A quiet federal indictment offered him the opportunity to spin a narrative, to hire expensive lawyers, and to play the victim in the press. I required a public execution. I needed to dismantle his fake aristocratic empire in front of the very people he sought to impress. I closed my eyes, the cold metal of the flash drive pressing safely against my thigh through the fabric of my trousers. The investigation was over. The execution protocol was officially active. The sun crested the horizon, bleeding pale morning light across the granite countertops of our kitchen. I stood barefoot on the cold tile, grinding espresso beans. The mechanical whir of the machine masked the sound of Trent descending the staircase. He walked into the kitchen wearing a freshly pressed navy suit, adjusting his silk tie with practiced precision. He smelled of cedar cologne and unearned confidence. I pulled a porcelain mug from the cabinet. I forced my hands to adopt a slight, erratic tremble. I poured the steaming espresso, letting a single drop spill over the rim and hit the counter. I wiped it away frantically, muttering a disjointed apology. Trent paused. He stepped closer, leaning against the kitchen island. He watched my manufactured panic with a gaze of profound, satisfying pity. He reached out and wrapped his large hand over my shaking fingers. "You are exhausted, Willow," he murmured, his voice adopting a sickening, buttery tone of fake concern. "Look at you. You are shaking. You cannot even pour a cup of coffee." I lowered my chin, breaking eye contact. I forced my breathing to shallow out, mimicking the physical symptoms of an impending anxiety attack. "I did not sleep well," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly on the final syllable. "I keep forgetting things. I feel like my head is surrounded by fog." Trent sighed, a heavy exhalation designed to convey immense burden. He stepped closer and wrapped his arms around my shoulders, pulling me against his chest. It required every ounce of my physical restraint to avoid driving a ceramic knife into his ribs. I melted against his expensive suit, playing the broken, dependent wife. "Your mind is fracturing, sweetheart," Trent said, resting his chin on the top of my head. "This data entry job is breaking you down. I scheduled a consultation with a private psychiatric clinic for next week. We need to get you an evaluation before you completely lose your grip." I nodded against his lapel. "You are right, Trent. Whatever you think is best." He kissed the crown of my head, a gesture of absolute dominance. He genuinely believed he had crushed my intellect into dust. He grabbed his leather briefcase from the counter, offered me a patronizing smile, and walked out the front door. The heavy oak slammed shut. The deadbolt clicked into place. I stood in the center of the kitchen. I counted to 30. Listening to the low rumble of his leased sports car pulling out of the driveway and accelerating down the suburban street. The second the engine noise faded, my posture snapped entirely straight. The manufactured tremble in my hands vanished, replaced by the rigid, lethal stillness of an auditor holding an execution order. I walked to the sink and poured the remaining espresso down the drain. I returned to the master bedroom and retrieved the encrypted flash drive from the pocket of my trousers. I bypassed my personal cell phone. Trent likely monitored the billing records and walked back into my home office. I booted my Treasury-issued terminal. I engaged a military-grade virtual private network and launched a secure, untraceable satellite communication protocol. I typed in a localized sequence of numbers, establishing a direct connection to a secured line in downtown Chicago. The line rang twice. A deep, gravelly voice answered. "State your clearance," the voice demanded. "The ledger is compromised," I replied, reciting the authentication phrase. My older brother, Gideon, exhaled sharply on the other end of the connection. "Willow, it is 6 a.m. Why are you utilizing the secure protocol?" Gideon served as a senior federal prosecutor for the Northern District. He operated with the ruthless, surgical precision of a shark scenting blood in the water. At 38, he possessed an unyielding sense of justice and a deep, abiding hatred for my in-laws. From the day I introduced Trent to my family, Gideon recognized the grifter hiding behind the bespoke suits and the Mayflower pedigree. He tolerated the marriage solely because I demanded he respect my choices. I require you to clear your docket for the morning. Gideon, I stated, my voice echoing off the dark walls of the office. I am transmitting a compressed data packet to your secure terminal. You need to open it immediately. I initiated the file transfer. The progress bar flashed across my screen. 3 seconds later, Gideon confirmed receipt. I listened to the sharp, rapid clacking of his mechanical keyboard as he decrypted the folder. I remained perfectly silent, allowing the raw data to articulate the scope of the betrayal. The silence stretched for 4 excruciating minutes. I heard the faint rustle of paper on his end. I heard his breathing halt. "Willow," Gideon whispered. The tone of his voice stripped away the professional prosecutor, revealing the sheer protective fury of an older brother. "Is this a verified extraction?" I pulled the routing numbers directly from his hidden Cayman Island portals at 2 o'clock this morning, I replied. I cross-referenced the Delaware shell companies against the Vanguard Hope Foundation's public tax filings. He and Cordelia are approving phantom invoices. Paige, his event coordinator, is forging the procurement requests. $5 million. Gideon read the total aloud, the syllables striking like hammer blows. They embezzled $5 million from a children's charity. "Open the contingency subfolder," I instructed. I waited while he navigated the directory. I listened as he opened the scanned articles of incorporation and the drafted emails. I listened as he discovered the exact architecture of Trent's frame job. A sharp, violent crash echoed through the speakers. Gideon had swept a stack of objects off his desk, his legendary composure shattering into pure, unadulterated rage. "He forged your signature," Gideon snarled, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, predatory intensity. "He mapped your social security number to the offshore accounts. He is planning to hand you to my own agency for wire fraud. He intends to freeze my assets, claim I am psychologically unfit, and send me to a federal penitentiary," I confirmed, maintaining my glacial calm. "I am dispatching tactical," Gideon commanded, his fingers pounding the keyboard. "I am authorizing a no-knock federal raid on the Foundation headquarters. I will have the Federal Bureau of Investigation kick his glass doors off the hinges before he finishes his morning coffee. I will personally shackle him to his mahogany desk." "No," I interjected, my voice cutting through his fury like a razor blade. "Halt the authorization!" Gideon stopped typing. "Willow, he is actively framing you for a massive federal crime. We possess the unredacted ledgers. We execute the arrest warrants today." "A quiet midday office raid is entirely insufficient," I countered. "If you arrest him in his glass tower, he immediately calls a team of high-priced defense attorneys. Cordelia hires a crisis management firm. They spin a narrative. They claim it is a corporate misunderstanding. They manipulate the press, protect their aristocratic image, and paint me as the vengeful, unstable wife." I gripped the edge of my desk. I refused to let them hide behind a legal smokescreen. They spent 3 years mocking my clothing, insulting my intellect, and treating Leo like a diseased stray. I want to shatter their illusion in front of the very people they worship. Gideon let the silence hang over the secure connection. The prosecutor inside him analyzed the strategy, recognizing the raw, tactical advantage of a public execution. "What is your parameter?" Gideon finally asked, his voice cooling into a lethal, calculating register. "Cordelia hosts her annual Thanksgiving dinner at the end of next month," I stated. "She invites 20 of the wealthiest, most influential elites in the state, politicians, corporate executives, and generational heirs. She uses the event to solidify her social supremacy. I want to execute the trap while she sits at the head of that table." I leaned forward, my eyes locked on the monitors. "I need you to pull the back-end federal levers, Gideon. I need you to stage the tactical teams outside her estate. I will monitor the Cayman accounts. When the moment arrives, I will trigger the asset freeze through my treasury credentials. I want them stripped of their wealth and hauled out of their own dining room in handcuffs while their billionaire friends watch." Gideon let out a low, dark chuckle. The sound carried the absolute certainty of a predator aligning with its pack. "You want a public slaughter," Gideon clarified. "I want them reduced to ash," I confirmed. "I will assemble the task force," Gideon promised. I will coordinate the Internal Revenue Service investigators and the Federal Bureau of Investigation tactical units. We will build an impenetrable perimeter around Cordelia's estate. No one moves until you give the signal. Ensure the teams remain completely invisible, I ordered. Trent believes he controls the timeline. He believes he is playing a flawless game of chess against a broken pawn. Let him enjoy his false victory for a few more weeks. The snare is set, Willow, Gideon said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. We execute on Thanksgiving. I terminated the connection. The screen faded to black. I sat in the silent home office, the cold precision of the plan locking into place. Trent demanded a war of psychological manipulation and digital forgery. He assumed my silence equated to submission. He failed to realize that silence is the primary weapon of an apex predator, patiently waiting for the trap to snap shut. To execute a flawless federal sting operation, an investigator requires more than just isolated fragments of offshore data. Gideon's task force possessed the Cayman Island account numbers and the Delaware Shell Company registrations. I held the forged identity documents, however, to permanently bind Trent and Cordelia to the embezzlement. The Department of the Treasury demanded an undeniable, localized bridge. We needed the physical routing hashes stored directly on the Vanguard Hope Foundation's internal servers. Cordelia operated with the intense, localized paranoia of a seasoned grifter. She refused to host the master financial ledgers on a cloud-based network, terrified of external data breaches. Instead, she housed the unredacted master drives on a secured, closed-circuit terminal locked inside the private study of her sprawling suburban estate. I needed physical access to that machine. The opportunity materialized during our mandatory Sunday family dinner in late October. We arrived at Cordelia's gated property just after 5 o'clock. The estate served as a monument to her fabricated aristocracy, featuring towering Corinthian columns, manicured hedge mazes, and a driveway paved with imported cobblestone. We walked through the double mahogany doors and entered the formal dining room. A massive crystal chandelier illuminated a long table set with polished antique silver and fine bone china. Cordelia sat at the head of the table. At 62, her face remained frozen in a tight, unyielding mask of cosmetic perfection. She wore a heavy silk blouse and a pearl necklace that cost more than an average college tuition. Trent took his seat to her right, swirling a glass of expensive Merlot. Sloane, Trent's 30-year-old sister, lounged across from him, aggressively tapping the screen of her smartphone while completely ignoring the rest of the room. I guided my 8-year-old son, Leo, to a chair near the far end of the table. He sat quietly, folding his hands in his lap, acutely aware of the freezing atmosphere. The domestic staff served plates of roasted lamb and truffle risotto. The moment the staff retreated to the kitchen, Cordelia initiated her customary psychological assault. She did not engage me in genuine conversation. She utilized me as a prop to elevate her own status. Cordelia set her silver fork down and stared pointedly at my attire. I wore a simple, charcoal gray wool cardigan and black trousers. "Willow," Cordelia drawled, her voice slicing through the clinking of silverware. "I genuinely admire your commitment to absolute mediocrity. You wear department store polyester to a formal Sunday dinner with the exact same confidence as the serving staff. It is truly remarkable." Sloane snorted, not bothering to look up from her phone screen. She probably thinks it blends in with the upholstery. Mother, leave her alone. Not everyone possesses the genetic capacity for elegance. I looked at Trent. He took a slow sip of his wine, a faint, patronizing smirk playing on his lips. He offered zero defense. He enjoyed watching his family diminish me, believing it reinforced my fragile, dependent persona. Leo shifted uncomfortably in his heavy wooden chair. He looked down at his plate, his small shoulders tensing. I reached under the table and squeezed his knee, offering a firm, silent reassurance. I did not break my facade. I lowered my gaze, adopting the posture of a humiliated, defeated woman. "I apologize, Cordelia," I murmured, keeping my tone submissive and quiet. "I did not have time to change after running errands this afternoon." Cordelia scoffed. picking up her wineglass. Errands, as if your tedious little data entry tasks consume so much vital energy. Do try to put forth a marginal effort next time. We have a legacy to maintain. I placed my linen napkin on the table and pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping softly against the Persian rug. "If you will excuse me," I whispered, maintaining my fractured demeanor. "I need to use the restroom." "Do hurry back," Trent mocked, slicing a piece of lamb. "We would hate to miss your scintillating conversation." I walked out of the dining room, my head bowed. I stepped into the grand, dimly lit hallway. The moment the dining room walls shielded me from their view, my posture snapped entirely straight. The humiliated wife vanished. The digital forensics auditor took command. I checked my watch. I possessed a maximum window of 6 minutes before my absence triggered their suspicion. I bypassed the guest bathroom entirely. I moved silently across the thick carpet runners, navigating the corridors until I reached the heavy oak doors of Cordelia's private study. I grasped the brass handle. It remained locked. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and produced a specialized tension wrench and a titanium lockpick, tools standard, issued during my early field training. I slipped the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applying microscopic pressure. I slid the pick inside, manipulating the heavy brass pins. 1, 2, 3. The cylinder turned with a soft, yielding click. I slipped inside the study and pulled the door shut, locking it behind me. The room smelled of old paper, leather polish, and stagnant ego. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with pristine, unread classic literature purchased entirely for aesthetic value. Sitting in the center of the room, resting on a massive mahogany desk, was a sleek, state-of-the-art desktop terminal. I stepped behind the desk and tapped the keyboard. The monitor flared to life, illuminating the dark study with a harsh white glow. A high-security password prompt materialized in the center of the screen. Shielded by commercial-grade encryption software, Cordelia paid a premium for this security suite, trusting it to protect her stolen empire. She failed to realize that commercial encryption relies on software barricades. A hardware override bypasses the software entirely. I reached into my pocket and retrieved a specialized universal serial bus mirroring device. It resembled a standard thumb drive, but it housed a complex Treasury-grade infiltration sequence designed to interface directly with the logic board architecture of the target machine. I inserted the device into the rear port of the terminal. I struck a sequence of command keys. The screen bypassed the commercial operating system entirely. Plunging into a stark, command line interface, I initiated the decryption protocol. The mirroring device flooded the terminal's logic board with rapid, sequential cryptographic keys, hammering the firewall at a rate of 10,000 attempts per second. I checked my watch. 1 minute and 30 seconds elapsed. I stared at the scrolling green text, listening to the mechanical whir of the terminal's cooling fan kicking into overdrive. 3 minutes and 10 seconds. The firewall collapsed. The command line interface dissolved, granting me unrestricted, unredacted access to the root directory of the Vanguard Hope Foundation. I navigated the internal folders with rapid precision. I bypassed the public-facing tax documents and the sanitized donor lists. I located a hidden, password-protected subdirectory titled simply Archive Logistics. I bypassed the secondary lock and opened the folder. The master ledgers populated the screen. I stared at the raw, unfiltered data. The sheer, unmitigated cruelty of their operation stared back at me in perfectly organized columns. I viewed the incoming donation logs. I saw a line item for $200,000, designated entirely for a pediatric oncology support program. I traced the corresponding outgoing transaction. Cordelia and Trent did not send the funds to the hospital. They generated a fraudulent invoice for medical transport consulting through Apex Logistical Solutions. The $200,000 routed directly to Delaware, scrubbed through the shell company, and landed in their Cayman Islands wealth management portal. I scrolled further. I found an allocation of $150,000 earmarked for an inner-city school lunch initiative. Trent routed it through Summit Event Management for catering outreach. The money paid for Sloane's new luxury sports car and a down payment on a Swiss ski chalet. They literally ripped food from the mouths of impoverished children to fund their aristocratic cosplay. They stole from dying patients to buy tailored suits and diamond necklaces. The freezing, absolute certainty of my mission locked my heart into a block of solid ice. I executed a mass data transfer, commanding the terminal to clone the entire directory onto the encrypted partition of my mirroring device. The progress bar marched across the screen. I checked my watch. 4 minutes and 40 seconds elapsed. The transfer completed with a sharp digital chime. I pulled the drive loose, gripping the cold metal in my palm. I ran a rapid scrubbing protocol, wiping the terminal's cache and erasing the access logs. I returned the machine to its locked, commercial operating state. The screen faded to black. I exited the study, resetting the brass lock behind me. I moved swiftly down the carpeted hallway and stepped into the guest bathroom. I locked the door, dropped the toilet seat, and flushed the plumbing. I turned on the brass faucet. Letting the cold water run over my wrists to regulate my pulse, I stared at my reflection in the gilded mirror. My eyes remained dark, flat, and entirely devoid of mercy. I dried my hands, slipped the digital guillotine securely into my pocket, and walked back to the dining room. I pulled my chair out and sat down next to Leo. The roasted lamb remained untouched on my plate. Sloane glanced up from her phone, rolling her eyes. "Did you get lost in the hallway, Willow, or did the sheer size of the house overwhelm your pedestrian senses?" Trent chuckled, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "She lacks spatial awareness, Sloane. Do not expect her to navigate anything more complex than a studio apartment." Cordelia smiled, swirling her Merlot. "We simply must lower our expectations. She operates at her maximum capacity." I looked at Cordelia. I looked at the stolen pearls resting against her collarbone, funded directly by an inner-city education grant. I looked at Trent's bespoke suit, paid for by a pediatric oncology donation. I reached under the table, my fingertips brushing the cold metal casing of the flash drive resting in my pocket. I possessed the unredacted ledgers. I possessed the routing hashes. The federal trap possessed its final, unbreakable bridge. I offered Cordelia a quiet, submissive smile. "You are absolutely right, Cordelia," I murmured softly. "I'm operating exactly where I belong." Mid-November brought a bitter, biting chill to the Chicago air, signaling the approach of the holiday season. Exactly 2 weeks before the Thanksgiving execution, the Vanguard Hope Foundation hosted its annual fundraising gala. They rented the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive luxury hotel, an architectural masterpiece of vaulted ceilings, gilded archways, and cascading crystal chandeliers. The event served as a sickening monument to false philanthropy. Ice sculptures shaped like soaring doves melted slowly into silver drainage trays. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated silently, balancing trays of beluga caviar and vintage champagne. A string quartet occupied a raised mahogany stage, filling the cavernous space with classical arrangements. The entire production cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. A massive expenditure billed under the guise of raising awareness for impoverished youth. I skirted the perimeter of the ballroom, intentionally fusing with the background. I wore a simple off-the-rack navy sheath dress and practical heels, rejecting the designer gowns favored by the social elite. I required absolute invisibility. I stood near a towering marble pillar, a glass of sparkling water resting in my hand, observing the predators operating in their natural habitat. Cordelia dominated the center of the room. She wore an emerald silk gown that dragged heavily across the polished floor. She targeted generational heirs and corporate titans, cornering them near the silent auction tables. She did not merely ask for donations. She demanded tribute. "A pledge of $100,000 ensures the new pediatric wing carries your family crest," Cordelia dictated to a local real estate magnate, her voice slicing through the classical music. "We accept nothing less than total commitment to the legacy." The magnate nodded, pulling a platinum credit card from his tuxedo jacket, entirely oblivious to the fact that his contribution would finance her next Swiss wellness retreat. Sloane drifted between the high-top tables, holding a crystal flute. She contributed absolutely zero effort to the fundraising. Utilizing the gala as a personal networking event, she threw her head back, laughing aggressively at a joke told by a wealthy investment banker, eyeing his expensive watch with undisguised greed. A sharp chime echoed through the ballroom speakers, signaling the keynote address. The guests gravitated toward the stage, their designer shoes sinking into the thick carpet. Trent stepped up to the podium. He adjusted the microphone, projecting an aura of solemn, manufactured humility. He wore a bespoke tuxedo tailored to perfectly accentuate his broad shoulders. He gripped the edges of the podium, lowering his head for a brief, theatrical second before looking out over the crowd of billionaires. "Tonight, we gather not for ourselves, but for the forgotten," Trent began, his voice resonating with deep, practiced emotion. "I recently visited a community center on the south side. I met a young boy shivering in the cold, lacking a simple winter coat. Your generosity tonight guarantees that boy, and thousands like him, survive the winter. We build hope. We build the future." He placed a hand over his heart, squeezing his eyes shut to force a single, fabricated tear to the surface. The sheer hypocrisy radiated from the stage, noxious and suffocating. He spoke of freezing children while actively bleeding the charity to fund his Cayman Islands accounts. The aristocratic crowd swallowed the performance whole. They erupted into thunderous applause, pulling mobile devices from their pockets to access the foundation's digital donation portal as Trent descended the stage, bathing in the adulation. A figure stepped out from the shadows near the catering entrance. Paige. The 26-year-old event coordinator wore a plunging crimson gown that flagrantly violated the gala's professional dress code. She hovered near the edge of the crowd, watching Trent with hungry, possessive eyes as he brushed past her, moving to shake hands with a wealthy donor. He let his hand drop to his side. His fingers grazed Paige's waist, a fleeting, brazen micro-interaction executed in a room filled with hundreds of people. Paige smirked, lifting her chin, catching the light of the cascading chandeliers. A brilliant flash of silver erupted from her collarbone. It was the $15,000 platinum and diamond tennis necklace. She wore the stolen jewelry openly, flaunting the spoils of his embezzlement right in front of the charity's board of directors and right in front of his wife. She believed her position was unassailable. She believed she occupied the winning side of the board. I did not flinch. I did not storm across the ballroom to tear the diamonds from her neck. The sting of the infidelity had long since burned away, leaving behind a cold, hardened core of absolute focus. I turned my back to the crowd and retreated deeper into a shadowed alcove near the emergency exit. I opened my small evening clutch and withdrew a secondary, encrypted mobile device. The night prior, utilizing the master ledgers I extracted from Cordelia's study, I mapped the digital architecture of the Foundation's payment gateways. Trent possessed decent programming skills, but he lacked the sophistication of a treasury auditor. He built an automated application programming interface. The script scraped the incoming digital donations the exact second the funds cleared the merchant holding ledger, automatically rerouting the capital to his Delaware shell companies to avoid manual oversight. He automated his own federal wire fraud. I bypassed my device's standard operating system, launching a secure command line interface. I initiated a direct handshake with the Foundation's back-end servers, utilizing the backdoor access I established during the Sunday dinner intrusion. The screen glowing in my palm turned black, populated by rapid streams of green text. A notification flashed across the top of my screen. The real estate magnate Cordelia cornered earlier had just processed his pledge. Incoming transfer. $100,000 status cleared. I watched the screen, tracking the capital. The second the money hit the Vanguard Hope Foundation's primary operational account, Trent's automated script triggered. Outgoing transfer initiated. The script carved the $100,000 into fragmented payouts. $30,000 routed to Summit Event Management for fabricated catering logistics. $70,000 bounced to Apex Logistical Solutions for phantom medical transport. Destination Delaware. I engaged a specialized network sniffer tool, intercepting the data packets mid-transfer. I captured the live transaction hashes. the exact timestamps, and the specific digital signatures authorizing the movement. The script executed its final command. The funds bounced from the Delaware shell companies, scrubbing the domestic origin, and launched across the international wire. Destination Cayman Islands. I possess the active, real-time proof of international money laundering. I compiled the captured transaction hashes into a compressed, encrypted packet. I opened a secure, satellite-uplinked communication channel tethered directly to Gideon's Federal Task Force terminal in downtown Chicago. I typed a single line of text, live execution captured. Confirm receipt. I hit the send command. The data vaulted from my encrypted device, sailing over the heads of the celebrating aristocrats, and landed directly on the desk of a ruthless federal prosecutor. 10 seconds later, Gideon's response materialized on my screen. Receipt confirmed. The snare is tight. I locked the device, the screen fading to black, and slipped the digital weapon back into my evening clutch. I stepped out of the shadowed alcove and merged back into the glittering crowd. The string quartet transitioned into a lively waltz. Waiters circulated with fresh trays of champagne. I located Trent standing near the center of the room. He clinked his crystal flute against Cordelia's glass, offering a toast to their massive fundraising success. Paige stood a few feet away, her fingers tracing the stolen diamonds resting on her skin. They laughed, intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance, entirely oblivious to the invisible net tightening around their throats. I picked up a glass of sparkling water from a passing silver tray. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the cold liquid ground my senses. I stood in a grand ballroom surrounded by actively operating criminals, breathing the same recycled air, entirely unbothered by their arrogance. I was meticulously braiding the rope they would ultimately use to hang themselves, and the execution date was rapidly approaching. The days following the Vanguard Hope Foundation Gala bled into a grueling routine of domestic espionage. I possessed the master ledgers, the Cayman Island routing hashes, and the live transaction logs capturing their active money laundering. The federal trap, orchestrated by my brother Gideon, sat perfectly primed, requiring only my final authorization. I operated under the assumption that the absolute peak of their malice rested in the $5 million frame job. I was wrong. A financial predator views human beings as line items on a balance sheet. When a line item becomes an obstacle to liquidity, the predator liquidates the obstacle. It happened 3 days before Thanksgiving. A vicious sleet storm battered the windows of our suburban estate, plunging the afternoon into a dark, freezing gray. Trent occupied the living room, lounging on the leather sofa, watching a golf tournament while nursing a glass of expensive bourbon. He left his primary mobile device resting on the marble kitchen island. I did not need physical possession of his phone. I utilized my home office terminal to monitor the mirror program I had injected into our router's firmware. The program intercepted every packet of data transmitted from his device, decrypting the payloads in real time. I sat in my ergonomic chair, sipping black coffee, auditing the incoming data streams. A notification pinged on my secondary monitor. Trent had opened a secure, encrypted messaging application to communicate with Cordelia. I initiated the interception protocol. The live text exchange populated my screen, displaying the raw, unfiltered conversation between a mother and her narcissistic son, Trent. The asset seizure paperwork is finalized. The attorney confirmed that the moment the Federal Bureau of Investigation indicts her for the $5 million, I secure emergency conservatorship over the marital estate. Cordelia, excellent. Ensure the judge seals the accounts immediately. We cannot risk her retaining independent defense counsel. Trent handled. Her Treasury credentials will be revoked the second the tip hits the federal portal on Monday. Cordelia and the boy. I refuse to have him wandering my halls crying for his mother while you execute the liquidation. I will not tolerate his presence. The blood in my veins stopped flowing. I ceased breathing, my eyes locked onto the screen, tracking the flashing cursor as Trent typed his response. Trent. He is not staying here. I finalized the enrollment packet for the Blackwood Disciplinary Academy out in Wyoming. Cordelia, the behavioral camp. Do they accept children that young? Trent? They accept 8-year-olds if the parents authorize extreme intervention protocols. I signed the waivers this morning using Willow's forged digital signature. He ships out on a transport van the exact same morning the authorities raid the house. A ringing. High-pitched frequency flooded my ears. The clinical, detached shield of the forensic auditor cracked, splintering under the crushing weight of a mother's absolute terror. I commanded my terminal to pull the browsing history from Trent's device. I ran a search for the Blackwood Disciplinary Academy. The website loaded. The institution operated as a brutal, unregulated reform camp located in a desolate, freezing expanse of the Wyoming mountains. It catered to wealthy parents seeking to discard troubled teenagers. The facility boasted of its isolation tactics. I breached the unencrypted portal Trent utilized to submit the application. I downloaded the portable document format files he had attached to Leo's file. I opened the documents. The sheer sociopathic cruelty printed on the screen defied human comprehension. Trent had checked a series of boxes classifying my quiet, polite 8-year-old son as a violent, uncontrollable delinquent requiring immediate institutional subjugation. He authorized the use of physical restraints. He consented to solitary confinement protocols. He signed a strict communications blackout agreement, legally barring Leo from making a single telephone call or receiving mail for the first 6 months of his internment. I scrolled to the final page. My forged signature sat cleanly on the authorization line. I pulled the motive apart, analyzing the legal strategy behind this atrocity. Trent was not merely removing an inconvenience, he was executing a tactical maneuver to block Gideon. If the federal authorities arrested me, Child Protective Services would immediately place Leo into emergency custody. Gideon, as a federal prosecutor and Leo's biological uncle, would instantly file for guardianship. The moment Gideon entered the family court arena, he would demand a full, independent audit of the marital estate to protect Leo's financial interests. Gideon's intervention would freeze the very assets Trent planned to liquidate. To prevent my brother from halting the asset seizure, Trent needed Leo completely off the board by forging my signature and shipping my son across state lines to a private lockdown facility before the arrest occurred. Trent ensured Leo vanished into a legal black hole. My son would be trapped in a freezing Wyoming compound, subjected to physical abuse and total isolation, wondering why his mother abandoned him. The coffee mug in my hand shattered. The ceramic cracked under the sudden, violent pressure of my grip, sending hot black liquid cascading across the glass surface of my desk. I did not flinch. I did not feel the scalding heat against my skin. Every single protocol I adhered to as a federal investigator: objectivity, emotional restraint, procedural detachment vaporized in that exact second. The operation ceased to exist as a financial audit. This was no longer about corporate embezzlement, stolen charity funds, or Delaware shell companies. This was a declaration of war against my child. I stood up from the desk, my chair rolled backward, colliding heavily with the wall. I walked out of the home office. I bypassed the staircase leading down to the living room, where Trent sat drinking bourbon and watching golf. I walked down the carpeted hallway and quietly pushed open the heavy wooden door to Leo's bedroom. The room was bathed in the soft, warm glow of a small nightlight shaped like a rocket ship. Rain lashed steadily against the window pane. Leo lay fast asleep, curled beneath a heavy quilt. He clutched a worn, frayed stuffed bear he had carried since he was a toddler. His breathing rose and fell in a slow, peaceful rhythm. He looked incredibly small. He looked innocent, entirely oblivious to the monsters operating beneath the same roof. I stepped into the room and approached the edge of the mattress. I sank to my knees, resting my forearms against the edge of the bed. I reached out, my hand trembling for the first time in months, and gently brushed a lock of dark hair away from his forehead. His skin was warm. He shifted slightly, leaning into the touch of my hand, and let out a quiet, contented sigh before settling back into his deep slumber. I stared at his face. I pictured two strange men arriving at our house at dawn, dragging him out of his bed while tactical officers hauled me away in handcuffs. I pictured him locked in a freezing room in Wyoming, crying out for me, subjected to the ruthless discipline of a military camp, believing I had signed the papers authorizing his torture. A cold, dark void opened inside my chest, swallowing the final shreds of my humanity. I did not weep. Tears are an expression of grief, and I had bypassed grief entirely. I had reached a state of absolute, concentrated malice. I leaned closer, resting my forehead gently against the mattress near his small shoulder. "I have you," I whispered into the quiet room, my voice a lethal, vibrating promise. "I promise you, they will never touch a single hair on your head." I stood up, stepping away from the bed. I walked out of the room, leaving the door cracked open just an inch, preserving the quiet sanctuary of his sleep. I returned to my home office and locked the deadbolt. I grabbed a cloth and wiped the spilled coffee from my desk, moving with brutal, mechanical efficiency. I sat down and initiated a secure communication channel with Gideon. I did not send a data packet, I typed a direct, overriding command into the terminal. "The parameter has shifted. They forged custody documents to enter my son in a disciplinary camp upon my arrest. The financial execution is no longer sufficient," Gideon replied, less than 10 seconds later. I could feel the homicidal rage radiating through the digital text. "I am authorizing asset forfeiture protocols. I will ensure they face the maximum federal enhancement for child endangerment. What is your directive?" I stared at the glowing screen. I thought about Cordelia slapping my son's face. I thought about Trent signing a document authorizing physical restraints for an 8-year-old boy. "Burn the entire structure to the foundation," I typed, my fingers striking the keys like a gavel. "Leave them with absolutely nothing. Strip their accounts, seize their properties, and ensure they spend the remainder of their natural lives in concrete cells. We execute the trap on Thanksgiving." I terminated the connection. I sat in the dark office, staring at the flashing cursor. The financial trap had successfully morphed into a deeply personal execution. The coiled spring compressed to its absolute breaking point, locking in its position, ready to deliver a catastrophic payload. Trent and Cordelia assumed they were hunting a quiet, compliant wife. They failed to realize they had just stepped into the jaws of a mother ready to rip their world to shreds. I sat in the oppressive darkness of my home office, bathed solely in the sharp blue light of my Treasury-issued terminal. The digital clock on the bottom corner of the primary monitor flipped to exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. The final phase of the operation commenced. I bypassed the standard domestic gateways, engaging a direct, heavily encrypted connection to the International Banking Clearinghouse. My fingers struck the mechanical keys with fluid, lethal precision, inputting the highest-level administrative override codes assigned to my federal clearance. I located the specific routing hashes tying Trent and Cordelia's Delaware shell corporations to their Cayman Islands wealth management portal. I did not freeze the assets yet. A premature freeze would trigger automated alerts to Trent's mobile device, granting him a precious window to panic, destroy his physical hard drives, and scramble a defensive legal strategy. Instead, I deployed a sleeper protocol. It functioned as a digital guillotine, suspended by a single line of code directly above their stolen $5 million. The script lay dormant within the banking mainframe, waiting for a localized command from my encrypted mobile device to sever the connection, lock the accounts entirely, and transfer ownership of the capital to the Federal Forfeiture Division. The snare was flawlessly primed. I extracted my flash drive, powered down the workstation, and locked the office door behind me. I walked down the hallway and entered the kitchen. The rich, heavy scent of cinnamon and roasting poultry hung thickly in the air. Trent had ordered a lavish, pre-prepared holiday breakfast from a boutique downtown catering service, staging a grotesque, unearned pantomime of domestic bliss. He stood at the marble kitchen island, sipping a shot of espresso. He wore a tailored cashmere sweater and perfectly pressed trousers, looking like a catalog model for aristocratic leisure. When I entered, Trent set his porcelain cup down and smiled. It was a broad, charismatic expression, entirely devoid of genuine human warmth. He crossed the kitchen, wrapped his arms around my waist, and pressed a firm, theatrical kiss against my cheek. "Happy Thanksgiving, Willow," he murmured, his voice dripping with fabricated devotion. I want today to be absolutely perfect. We have so much to be thankful for this year." I offered a small, compliant nod, forcing my muscles to remain relaxed in his grip. He truly believed his masterpiece was finished. I knew his exact timeline. He planned to endure the holiday weekend, play the loving father and husband for his elite audience, and then walk into his corner office on Monday morning to submit the forged digital dossier to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He thought he was spending his final holiday anchored to a broken, unstable woman. He pulled back slightly, his eyes scanning my face with a practiced look of synthetic concern. "Did you remember to take your anxiety supplement this morning?" he asked, layering the patronizing tone perfectly. "Mother is hosting 20 guests today. I know crowds trigger your paranoia. I just want to ensure you keep your grip on reality during dinner." I took it. "Trent," I whispered, lowering my gaze to play the submissive victim one final time. "I will be perfectly fine." He patted my shoulder, satisfied with my fractured demeanor, and turned back to his espresso. I stepped away from the kitchen island and moved toward the hallway to check on my 8-year-old son. Leo sat on the edge of his bed, quietly lacing his dark dress shoes. He wore a pressed button-down shirt and a small navy tie, his expression clouded with the familiar, heavy anxiety that always preceded a visit to Cordelia's estate. He knew the environment was hostile, even if he did not possess the vocabulary to articulate their elitist cruelty. I knelt in front of him, resting my hands firmly on his small knees. "You stay right by my side today," I whispered, holding his gaze to ensure he absorbed the absolute, unshakable certainty in my voice. "No matter what happens, you are safe. Do you understand me?" Leo nodded, his small shoulders relaxing a fraction of an inch under my grip. I stood up and packed his canvas tote bag, neatly arranging his favorite books, a set of colored pencils, and his handheld gaming console. I packed the bag not merely to entertain him, but to guarantee he possessed a quiet distraction when the formal dining room inevitably transformed into an active federal crime scene. I returned to the master suite to prepare myself. For 3 years, I had dressed to appease their relentless condescension, burying my identity in cheap polyester and oversized, muted cardigans to maintain the illusion of a pedestrian data entry clerk. I walked into my walk-in closet and bypassed the submissive garments. I reached into the very back of my wardrobe and retrieved a sharp, tailored black blazer crafted from heavy Italian wool. I paired it with crisp, structured trousers and polished leather heels. I pinned my dark hair back into a sleek, severe twist. The woman staring back at me in the full-length mirror bore no resemblance to the fragile, paranoid wife Trent detailed in his forged email drafts. She projected the cold, uncompromising authority of a federal executioner. I picked up my clutch, verifying the encrypted mobile device rested securely inside the inner pocket, and walked downstairs. Trent waited by the front door, tapping his keys against his palm. He paused when I descended the staircase, his eyes sweeping over my tailored blazer and polished heels. A flicker of genuine confusion crossed his features, quickly suppressed and replaced by a patronizing smirk. "Well," Trent chuckled, pulling the heavy oak door open. "Look at you, putting in a genuine effort for Mother. I appreciate you trying to elevate your standard for the holiday. Willow, it shows growth." I smiled silently, gripping my clutch, and walked past him into the biting November cold. We slid into the plush leather seats of his leased European sports vehicle. The engine roared to life, heating the cabin as we backed out of the driveway and merged onto the highway. The drive to Cordelia's estate stretched for 45 minutes. The atmosphere inside the vehicle felt suffocatingly dense. Trent dominated the space, turning the volume of the stereo down just enough to ensure I heard every single word of his relentless bragging. He drummed his fingers against the leather steering wheel, his chest puffed with unearned, stolen pride. "The Vanguard Hope Foundation is entering a massive expansion phase," Trent declared, his eyes locked on the road ahead. "Mother and I are launching a secondary capital campaign in January. The board is thrilled with my quarterly projections. I anticipate they will officially elevate me to Chief Executive Officer by the spring." He rattled off his fabricated accomplishments, outlining the corporate milestones he intended to achieve. He spoke of the future with absolute, unshakable certainty. He detailed the upcoming renovations to the charity headquarters and the new inner-city initiatives he planned to launch. Every word he spoke was a meticulously constructed lie, designed to mask the $5 million he had siphoned into his offshore accounts. He actively financed his delusions of grandeur with the stolen futures of impoverished children. And he sat next to me, bragging about his impending promotion. "Mother invited the mayor and 2 federal judges today," Trent continued, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Try to keep to yourself, Willow. Let the adults handle the networking." I turned my head, looking out the passenger window, bare. Skeletal trees and frost-covered fields blurred past the glass. I did not engage his monologue. I did not offer praise, nor did I defend my intelligence. I let his arrogance fill the cabin, feeding the cold, dark void in my chest. He was a man actively planning to send his 8-year-old stepson to an abusive, disciplinary military camp in Wyoming just to secure his own financial liquidity. He sat mere inches away, radiating triumph, completely unaware that his timeline ended today. I counted down the miles. I counted down the minutes. The digital locks hovered over his offshore accounts, waiting for my signal. Gideon's tactical teams were currently staging in unmarked transport vans on the perimeter of Cordelia's neighborhood. The trap was perfectly assembled. I watched the frost clinging to the highway signs, letting the icy landscape mirror my absolute resolve. Trent wanted a war of deception. He wanted to manipulate reality and play the architect of my destruction. He had no idea that I held the detonator, and the countdown was in its final. Silent seconds. The heavy iron gates of Cordelia's estate parted. The leased sports car crunched along the imported cobblestone driveway, stopping beneath the towering portico. A hired valet opened my door. The biting November wind whipped across the manicured lawns. I stepped out, gripping Leo's hand firmly, and walked through the double mahogany doors into a den of active federal criminals. The foyer hummed with the overlapping voices of 20 guests. These were not ordinary neighbors. Cordelia had assembled the highest concentration of wealth and political influence in the county. I recognized a prominent appellate judge, the city mayor, and a real estate tycoon whose company dominated the downtown skyline. Waiters in crisp black uniforms navigated the crowd, balancing silver trays of champagne flutes and artisanal hors d'oeuvres. Cordelia held court in the center of the grand living room. She wore a tailored burgundy silk dress that pooled elegantly at her feet. Resting heavily against her collarbone was a cascade of brilliant cut diamonds. The jewels caught the light of the crystal chandelier, throwing refracted prisms across the walls. I stared at the necklace. I knew its exact origin. She purchased those diamonds in late September, using a wire transfer scrubbed through Apex Logistical Solutions, a transfer funded directly by an inner-city literacy grant. She wore the stolen futures of impoverished students around her neck, smiling as the mayor complimented her exquisite taste. Trent immediately abandoned us, merging into the crowd of elites. He grasped the hand of the appellate judge, laughing heartily, projecting the polished aura of a successful executive. Sloane leaned against the grand piano, nursing a martini. She nodded along to a conversation with a tech entrepreneur, her eyes constantly darting toward his expensive timepiece, calculating his net worth. I guided Leo through the periphery of the room, avoiding the center of attention. We stood near a towering floral arrangement until the domestic staff chimed a silver bell, signaling the start of the holiday meal. The guests migrated into the formal dining room. The space was a masterclass in suffocating opulence. A massive mahogany table stretched across the length of the room, draped in pristine white linen and lined with fine bone china. Polished antique silver gleamed beneath a secondary chandelier. Seating arrangements at Cordelia's estate functioned as a strict hierarchy of social value. Cordelia claimed the head of the table. Trent took the seat of honor immediately to her right. The politicians and tycoons flanked them, occupying the premium real estate. Cordelia designated the far end of the table for Leo and me. Our chairs sat perilously close to the swinging doors of the kitchen, physically isolating us from the primary conversation. It was a deliberate, calculated insult designed to reinforce our lack of pedigree. I pulled out Leo's heavy wooden chair. He climbed onto the seat, his dark dress shoes dangling inches above the Persian rug. He folded his hands neatly in his lap, his eyes fixed on the pristine white tablecloth. He understood the hostility of the room, instinctively minimizing his presence to avoid drawing Cordelia's wrath. I took the seat beside him, unfolding my linen napkin and placing it over my lap. The staff emerged from the kitchen, serving plates of roasted turkey, spiced butternut squash, and artisan stuffing. The room filled with the clinking of heavy silver on porcelain. Cordelia waited until the guests began eating before she initiated her psychological assault. She required an audience. She raised her wineglass, swirling the deep red Cabernet, and directed her gaze down the length of the mahogany table. "We are truly blessed this year," Cordelia announced, her voice projecting effortlessly over the ambient chatter. She looked at the mayor, offering a radiant, synthetic smile. "Trent has elevated the Vanguard Hope Foundation beyond our wildest expectations. His dedication to charity is unparalleled. In fact, his charitable nature permeates every aspect of his life." Cordelia shifted her gaze, locking her cold eyes onto me. The smile remained on her lips, but the underlying venom seeped into her tone. "He possesses such a generous spirit," she continued, ensuring the entire table fell silent to listen. "Most men of his pedigree and corporate standing require a partner who understands the nuances of high society, a woman capable of hosting galas and managing estates. Yet, Trent settled for a simple data entry clerk. He brought someone from such ordinary stock into our family, completely unbothered by her lack of ambition or refinement. It truly speaks to his bleeding heart." A heavy, uncomfortable silence descended over the guests. The appellate judge shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. The real estate tycoon stared down at his plate. They recognized the flagrant cruelty of the remark, but their loyalty rested with the woman pouring the expensive wine. They chose their networking opportunities over basic human decency. Sloane scoffed from across the table, slicing a piece of turkey. "Do not flatter her, Mother. It is not a charitable endeavor. It is just a baffling lack of standards on his part. Some people are simply destined to file paperwork in a cubicle for the rest of their lives." Trent leaned back in his chair. He lifted his crystal tumbler of bourbon, a smug, patronizing smirk spreading across his face. He looked down the table at me, savoring my public humiliation. He believed he had trapped a broken, paranoid woman who would absorb the abuse in absolute silence. He expected me to lower my head and accept the degradation as the natural order of his universe. Leo shrank into his chair, his small shoulders hunched forward. He reached out under the table, his small fingers grasping the fabric of my tailored black blazer. I turned my hand over, wrapping my fingers firmly around his hand. I squeezed gently, anchoring him to my absolute certainty. I did not break my facade. I did not glare at Cordelia, nor did I snap back at Sloane. I picked up my crystal water goblet, took a slow, measured sip, and set it down without making a single sound. I offered Cordelia a blank, polite stare. I reached my free hand into my clutch resting on my lap. My fingertips brushed the smooth, cold surface of my encrypted mobile device. I bypassed the biometric scanner and opened the secure satellite communication application beneath the cover of the white linen tablecloth. The screen illuminated my lap with a faint, muted glow. I accessed the direct line to Gideon's terminal. A single encrypted message awaited me, transmitted just 3 minutes prior. It contained 3 words teams are holding. I stared at the glowing text. The reality of those 3 words painted a vivid, terrifying picture in my mind. Outside the towering iron gates of the estate, shielded by the freezing November darkness, an armada of unmarked transport vehicles idled silently on the suburban street. Inside those vans sat heavily armed tactical units from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and specialized financial investigators from the Internal Revenue Service. They wore dark ballistic vests, their weapons secured, their radios dialed to a unified, encrypted frequency. Gideon occupied the mobile command center, watching the thermal imaging feeds, holding a stack of federal warrants authorizing the immediate seizure of every asset, property, and offshore account tied to the Vanguard Hope Foundation. They formed an impenetrable perimeter around the property. They locked down every exit, secured every driveway, and waited in the biting cold. They monitored the communications arrays, completely prepared to execute a synchronized breach. They required a single, digitized signal from my device to rip the heavy wooden doors off their hinges. I locked the screen of my device and slipped it back into my clutch. I looked up, surveying the dining room. The atmosphere felt suffocatingly dense. The mahogany table functioned as a powder keg of staggering arrogance. Cordelia laughed, gesturing with her diamond-clad wrist as she recounted a story about a recent vacation to the French Riviera. Trent poured himself another measure of bourbon, boasting to the tech entrepreneur about his impending promotion to chief executive officer. Sloane complained about the service at a luxury boutique downtown. They sat in their gilded cage, chewing their roasted turkey, entirely consumed by their delusions of supremacy. They believed they manipulated reality. They believed they owned the board. They failed to comprehend that I had spent the last 3 months carefully packing the explosives around the foundational pillars of their lives. I had cloned their master ledgers. I had intercepted their live wire transfers. I had weaponized the very documents Trent forged to frame me. I had routed the federal task force directly to their front door. The coiled spring inside my chest reached its maximum compression. The pressure demanded a violent release. I sat perfectly still at the far end of the long mahogany table, holding my 8-year-old son's hand, breathing the recycled air of their fake aristocracy. I watched the second hand on my wristwatch sweep across the dial. The trap was locked. The snare was tight. The execution merely awaited the final spark. The domestic staff materialized from behind the swinging kitchen doors, carrying heavy silver trays laden with fresh artisan rolls and churned butter. They moved with silent, practiced efficiency, distributing the bread along the length of the mahogany table. A waiter placed a woven silver basket near the far corner of the table, positioning it exactly between Cordelia's sprawling, opulent place setting and the cramped, marginalized space allocated to Leo. Cordelia held her crystal Bordeaux glass by the stem, swirling the deep red Cabernet. She projected her voice over the clinking of silverware, dominating the conversation with a fabricated anecdote about a private yacht charter in the Mediterranean. The elite guests hung on her every word, nodding in synchronized, sycophantic rhythm. Leo shifted in his heavy wooden chair. He sat perfectly straight, his small hands resting in his lap. He eyed the breadbasket. He possessed a child's natural hunger, exacerbated by the suffocating tension of the room. He understood the unspoken rules of Cordelia's estate. Children of ordinary stock did not speak unless addressed. Rather than interrupt the matriarch's monologue to request a role, he opted for quiet independence. He extended his small arm, reaching carefully across the expanse of the white damask tablecloth. He almost cleared the perimeter of her place setting. As he retracted his arm, his dark suit cuff brushed the base of Cordelia's crystal wineglass. The heavy glass tilted. Cordelia's hand shot out, snatching the stem before the vessel toppled. But the sudden jerky movement disrupted the liquid inside. A single, dark drop of Cabernet crested the rim. It plummeted through the air and struck the pristine white linen tablecloth. The fabric absorbed the wine, blooming instantly into a stark, crimson stain. The conversation died. The ambient noise of the dining room evaporated. Cordelia stared at the red stain, the fragile, meticulously constructed facade of the aristocratic philanthropist shattered. Her eyes snapped upward, locking onto the 8-year-old boy sitting beside her. She did not see a child making an innocent mistake. She saw a parasite. She saw an unpedigreed invader actively contaminating her flawless, engineered reality. Her reaction bypassed verbal reprimand and escalated directly into feral, unhinged violence. Cordelia lunged across the corner of the mahogany table. Her arms swung in a wide, vicious arc. Her open palm struck Leo's cheek. The impact echoed through the cavernous dining room with a sharp, sickening crack. The sheer physical force of the blow lifted Leo from his seat. He tumbled backward, his chair tipping onto its hind legs, before crashing onto the polished hardwood floor. Leo hit the ground hard. his small hands flying up to cover his rapidly reddening face. He gasped for air, his eyes wide with profound, paralyzing shock. Cordelia loomed over him, her chest heaving, her diamond necklace rattling against her collarbone. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger toward the heavy oak doors of the foyer. "He is not real family," she shrieked, the aristocratic veneer peeling away to reveal the raw, toxic monster beneath. "Get out!" I did not scream. I did not leap across the table to tear her throat out. I turned my head, moving with absolute terrifying calculation, and looked directly at Trent. My husband sat in the seat of honor. He watched his 8-year-old stepson gasping on the floor. He possessed the physical proximity and the relational authority to intervene, to shield the child, to demand basic human decency from his mother. Trent did not move a single muscle in defense. He picked up his crystal tumbler. The ice clinked softly against the glass. He brought the rim to his lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of bourbon. He observed the violence with detached, clinical apathy. He chose his mother's stolen wealth over the safety of his family. He confirmed, in that single gesture, his absolute complicity. The 20 elite guests surrounding the table fell into a heavy, suffocated silence. The appellate judge lowered his fork. The real estate tycoon stared blankly at the floral centerpiece. Sloane froze, her smartphone suspended halfway to her face. They sat in their tailored suits and designer gowns, bearing witness to the physical assault of a child. And they did absolutely nothing. They waited for me to break. They expected the ordinary, submissive wife to burst into tears, scoop up her humiliated son, and flee into the freezing November night, retreating back into the obscurity they believed I deserved. They fundamentally miscalculated the geometry of the room. I pushed my heavy wooden chair back. The legs scraped against the Persian rug, a harsh grating sound that sliced through the absolute silence. I knelt beside Leo. He did not cry. He looked up at me, his small chest hitching, searching my face for the panic he expected to find. I did not offer panic. I offered a fortress. I gripped his small shoulders, pulling him up from the hardwood floor. I positioned him securely behind my legs, shielding him entirely from the view of the predators sitting at the table. I reached into the small black clutch resting on my chair. My fingers located the cold, smooth casing of my encrypted mobile device. I did not need to look at the screen. I knew the exact physical geography of the interface. I placed my thumb over the biometric scanner, unlocking the terminal. I opened the Treasury application. I navigated to the command line prompt hovering over the Cayman Islands routing hashes. I tapped the execution icon. The digital signal vaulted from my device, piercing the roof of the estate, bouncing off a secure federal satellite, and diving straight into the International Banking Clearinghouse. The sleeper protocol activated. Deep within the subterranean servers of the offshore wealth management portal, the execution script severed the foundational architecture of their $5 million empire. The digital locks slammed shut. The routing numbers vanished. Ownership of the capital transferred instantaneously from the Delaware shell corporations to the Asset Forfeiture Division of the United States federal government. The funds evaporated into a restricted holding ledger. The money ceased to exist. The trap snapped shut. I slipped the device back into the clutch. I stood up to my full height, towering over the corner of the table. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or hurl an insult. I looked down at my tailored black wool blazer. A tiny, imperceptible speck of lint rested near the lapel. I raised my hand and calmly, meticulously flicked the dust away. I raised my head. I swept my gaze past the terrified guests, past the apathetic Trent, and locked eyes with Cordelia. Cordelia stood at the head of the table, breathing heavily. She held a small porcelain bread plate in her left hand, preparing to hurl another venomous demand for my immediate departure. She stared at me, waiting for my submission. I delivered the execution order. "Your offshore accounts are completely frozen." The 6 words dropped into the center of the dining room with the concussive force of an explosive payload. Cordelia's cognitive processing stalled. Her brain registered the auditory input, but the sheer impossibility of the statement barricaded the comprehension. A low-level data entry clerk did not possess the vocabulary to discuss offshore accounts. A submissive, pedestrian wife did not speak with the lethal, resonant authority of a federal prosecutor. I watched the exact second the reality breached her psychological defenses. Her face went entirely slack. The rigid cosmetic perfection of her features dissolved, replaced by a sagging, gray mask of profound horror. The color drained from her cheeks, pulling the blood down into her neck. Her lips parted, attempting to form a syllable, but her vocal cords paralyzed. The muscles in her hand surrendered. The porcelain plate slipped from her fingers. It plummeted toward the floor, striking the polished hardwood with a sharp, violent crash. The porcelain shattered into dozens of jagged white shards, exploding across the Persian rug. Cordelia did not look down at the broken pieces. She remained frozen, her eyes wide, staring at me as the absolute collapse of her aristocratic illusion crushed the air from her lungs. The room stopped breathing, entirely oblivious to the federal tactical team currently advancing on the perimeter of the estate. The absolute silence in the dining room possessed a crushing, physical weight. The shattered fragments of Cordelia's porcelain plate lay scattered across the Persian rug, a brilliant white contrast against the dark. Woven wool. No one moved. The 20 elite guests sat paralyzed in their heavy mahogany chairs, their breaths hitched in their throats. The ambient ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing in the foyer echoed down the hallway, striking the air like a metronome counting down to a detonation. Trent broke the silence. He barked a laugh. The sound possessed a jagged, metallic edge. Scraping violently against the suffocating atmosphere, he gripped the edge of the dining table, his knuckles straining against his skin. He desperately attempted to reassemble his shattered alpha facade, projecting the polished aura of a corporate executive, neutralizing a minor boardroom disruption. He stood up, towering over the spread of roasted turkey and artisanal side dishes. He adjusted the lapels of his bespoke suit, turning his charismatic, hollow smile toward the appellate judge and the city mayor. "I sincerely apologize for the disruption. Everyone," Trent announced, raising his voice to command the room. He pointed a dismissive hand in my direction, refusing to look at his stepson still recovering on the floor behind me. "My wife is currently suffering a severe psychiatric episode. She has struggled with profound paranoia and extreme hallucinations for several months. Her mind is entirely fractured. Please, disregard her outburst. I will contact her medical provider immediately to arrange an emergency intervention." He delivered the lines flawlessly, reciting the exact narrative he had drafted in his hidden email folders. He played the tragic, burdened husband attempting to shield his elite guests from his wife's tragic mental decline. The guests wavered. The real estate tycoon shifted in his seat, his eyes darting between Trent's confident posture and my unwavering stance. A few attendees exhaled, ready to accept the convenient explanation. It offered them permission to ignore the violence Cordelia had just inflicted upon a child. It offered them an escape route back to their comfortable, aristocratic ignorance. But I did not break my stare. I kept my eyes locked on Trent. Watching the microscopic physical betrayals his body could no longer suppress. The panic was already bleeding through his eyes. Trent commanded the room with his voice, but his physiological responses rebelled. A thick, glistening sheen of cold sweat erupted along his hairline, catching the light of the crystal chandelier. The color leached from his face, leaving his complexion a sickly, mottled gray. A visible tremor seized his left hand, vibrating the pristine cuff of his tailored shirt. He knew my background. He knew I possessed the vocabulary and the analytical intellect of a federal auditor. The specific phrasing of my execution order offshore accounts bypassed his rational defenses and struck the absolute core of his hidden guilt. Trent reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket. His hand shook so violently he struggled to retrieve his mobile device. He pulled the sleek, expensive smartphone free, fumbling with the smooth casing. He did not call a medical provider. He did not dial a psychiatric clinic. He stared at the black screen, his thumb pressing against the biometric scanner. The scanner rejected the input. His skin was too slick with cold. Terrified sweat to register the fingerprint. Trent cursed under his breath, A sharp, panicked hiss. He swiped the screen, activating the manual keypad. He punched in his passcode, his fingers slipping against the glass. He bypassed his standard applications, opening the encrypted, secure folder housed deep within the device's architecture. He tapped the icon for the Cayman Islands Wealth Management portal. I stood at the far end of the table, shielding Leo, tracking every microscopic shift in Trent's demeanor. He expected the familiar, minimalist dashboard to populate his screen. He expected to view the aggregate balance of $5 million resting safely in the offshore vault. He needed the digital validation to anchor his sanity, to prove that his flawless criminal enterprise remained intact. The application initiated the handshake protocol. The screen flashed white. I watched the exact second the digital guillotine dropped. Trent's pupils dilated, expanding into massive, black pools of unmitigated horror. The screen did not load his balance. The interface stripped away the boutique banking logo, replacing it with a stark, blinding interface designed by the United States government. A glaring red banner spanned the width of his device. Bold, block letters materialized on the screen, burning the federal seizure notice directly into his retinas. Error. Access denied. Account frozen by order of the Department of the Treasury. Asset forfeiture protocol initiated. The blood completely vanished from Trent's face. The last remaining trace of his arrogance evaporated into the recycled air of the dining room. His respiratory system failed. He opened his mouth, pulling in rapid, shallow gulps of oxygen, but his lungs refused to expand. He stood paralyzed, staring at the physical proof of his absolute annihilation. Gravity claimed the device. The smartphone slipped through his paralyzed fingers. It plummeted toward the floor, striking the Persian rug with a dull, heavy thud. Trent's knees buckled. He braced his hands against the mahogany table, knocking over his crystal tumbler of bourbon. The amber liquid spilled across the white damask tablecloth. Mirroring the drop of Cabernet Leo had spilled just minutes prior, Trent collapsed into his heavy wooden chair, a hollow, broken shell of a man. At the head of the table, Cordelia tracked her son's physical deterioration. She watched the smartphone hit the floor. She watched the executive director of the Vanguard Hope Foundation fold into a hyperventilating panic. Trent's collapse confirmed my execution order. The nightmare was real. Cordelia's cognitive defenses shattered. The air vanished from her lungs. She opened her mouth, emitting a high-pitched, wheezing gasp. Her manicured fingers curled into sharp claws, raking against her own collarbone. She hooked her nails beneath the platinum setting of the $15,000 diamond tennis necklace. She clawed at the jewels, desperate to rip them away, suddenly realizing the diamonds functioned not as a crown, but as a heavy, inescapable noose. She slumped sideways in her chair, her emerald silk gown twisting awkwardly against the mahogany frame. She gasped for air, entirely consumed by the realization that her stolen aristocratic empire was actively burning to ash. The elite guests surrounding the table watched the dual collapse of the foundation's leaders. These individuals did not accumulate their wealth through ignorance. The appellate judge, the city mayor, and the real estate tycoon navigated the upper echelons of society by possessing a ruthless sense of self-preservation. They recognized the scent of a sinking ship. They understood the legal implications of the terminology I deployed. A domestic dispute regarding infidelity or a psychiatric episode offered them a convenient excuse to remain seated. But the phrase Department of the Treasury paired with the physical manifestation of offshore accounts signaled a catastrophic federal blast radius. It signaled wiretaps, asset seizures, grand jury subpoenas, and RICO indictments. They realized, in a wave of collective, paralyzing clarity, that they were not attending a holiday dinner. They were sitting in the exact epicenter of a massive federal crime scene. The appellate judge dropped his silver fork. The utensil clattered sharply against the bone china. He did not issue a farewell. He did not offer Cordelia a shred of sympathy. He pushed his chair backward, the wooden legs groaning against the rug. He grasped his wife's elbow, hauling her up from her seat. "We are leaving," the judge muttered, his voice tight with panic. Do not speak to anyone. Get to the car." The mayor abandoned his wineglass. He snapped his fingers, signaling his private security detail waiting near the foyer. The real estate tycoon threw his linen napkin onto his half-eaten turkey, ushering his family away from the table. The dining room erupted into a chaotic, scrambling retreat. Chairs overturned, expensive cashmere coats were snatched from the coat check closet. The elites prioritized their own survival, fleeing the mahogany table as if the roasted poultry were laced with arsenic. They stampeded toward the front doors, desperate to put physical distance between their reputations and Cordelia's impending federal indictment. Sloane stood up from her chair, her martini glass sloshing vodka over the rim. She lacked the intellectual capacity to comprehend the financial execution unfolding in front of her. She watched the billionaires fleeing her mother's estate, her face contorted in profound confusion. "Where are you going?" Sloane demanded, her voice shrill and uncomprehending. "Dinner is not finished, Trent. What is happening? Why is everyone leaving?" Trent did not answer his sister. He remained slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the spilled bourbon soaking into the tablecloth. His chest heaved in erratic, jerky spasms. The grand dining room emptied in less than 60 seconds. The symphony of clinking silver and arrogant networking died entirely, replaced by the chaotic sounds of luxury vehicles starting in the driveway and tires screeching against the cobblestone. I stood perfectly still at the far end of the desolate table. I kept my hands resting firmly on Leo's shoulders, anchoring him behind my legs. I surveyed the wreckage of their Thanksgiving dinner. The room resembled a graveyard of shattered porcelain, abandoned wealth, and obliterated egos. Trent finally lifted his head. His bloodshot eyes dragged across the empty chairs, locking onto my face, the realization of my true identity, the understanding that I had orchestrated every single element of this trap, finally pierced his fractured mind. He saw the apex predator staring back at him. He opened his mouth, preparing to speak, preparing to beg for the mercy he had ruthlessly denied my child. He never got the chance to form the syllable. With a concussive roar that rattled the crystal chandelier overhead, the heavy oak front doors of the estate exploded inward. The double doors didn't merely give way. They splintered into a hail of jagged oak and twisted brass under the crushing impact of a tactical battering ram, as the debris skipped violently across the polished foyer tile. The fragile illusion of their aristocratic sanctuary disintegrated in an instant. "Federal agents, keep your hands visible." The command thundered through the hallway, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. A tidal wave of tactical personnel flooded the residence. The agents wore matte black ballistic vests emblazoned with the bright yellow insignias of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. They poured into the grand foyer, their heavy tactical boots trampling over the priceless Persian runners. They moved with brutal, synchronized efficiency, fanning out across the first floor. A detachment of IRS cybercrimes investigators immediately broke off from the main formation, sprinting down the corridor directly toward Cordelia's private study to seize the physical servers hosting the unredacted ledgers. The primary tactical unit surged into the formal dining room. The visual contrast jarred the senses. Heavily armed operators carrying breaching tools and secured communication radios invaded the epicenter of fabricated aristocracy. The matte black Kevlar brushed against the fine bone china. The beams of their mounted flashlights sliced through the warm, refracted glow of the crystal chandelier. The domestic staff, carrying silver trays of dessert service, froze in their tracks. A waiter dropped a tray of pastries. It hit the floor with a metallic clatter. But nobody looked down. The staff pressed their backs flat against the floral wallpaper, raising their hands in absolute compliance. Sloane stood paralyzed near her chair. The martini glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the hardwood. She opened her mouth to emit a high-pitched scream, but an advancing tactical officer pointed a gloved finger directly at her chest. Issuing a sharp command to remain entirely silent, Sloane collapsed back into her heavy wooden chair, pulling her knees to her chest, her arrogant demeanor dissolving into violent, shuddering sobs. Trent stumbled backward from the mahogany table, his arms raised defensively, shielding his face from the blinding tactical lights. He retreated until his shoulders hit the antique credenza, knocking a silver candelabra to the floor. Cordelia remained anchored to her chair at the head of the table. Her jaw hung slack. Her chest heaved in rapid, shallow spasms, the stolen diamond necklace rising and falling against her collarbone. She watched the federal agents secure the perimeter of her dining room, completely incapable of processing the destruction of her empire. The tactical operators parted, creating a clear pathway through the center of the dining room. Gideon strode through the formation. My older brother did not wear tactical gear. He wore a razor-sharp, bespoke charcoal suit, projecting the immovable, lethal authority of a federal prosecutor. He carried a thick stack of manila folders secured with heavy binder clips, the physical manifestations of the digital execution I had initiated. Gideon did not look at the domestic staff. He did not look at the weeping Sloane. He walked directly toward the head of the mahogany table, his polished leather shoes crunching over the shards of Cordelia's broken porcelain plate. He stopped 3 feet away from Trent. He cast a brief, imperceptible glance toward the far end of the room. I had already retreated from the table, guiding Leo away from the immediate blast radius. We stood near the towering marble fireplace. I positioned Leo securely behind my legs, holding his small hand in mine, anchoring him to my absolute calm. Gideon offered me a single, confirming nod before returning his crosshairs to his target. "Trent," Gideon stated, his voice resonating with deep, baritonic precision, "you are officially out of time." Trent pushed himself off the credenza, desperately attempting to assemble the fragmented pieces of his corporate alpha facade. He smoothed the lapels of his suit jacket, his hands shaking so violently he nearly tore the fabric. "Gideon," Trent stammered, his voice cracking, completely lacking its usual patronizing resonance. "This is a massive misunderstanding. You need to call your teams off. I am the executive director of the Vanguard Hope Foundation. I was preparing to contact the authorities on Monday regarding a financial anomaly. I have documented proof that a rogue employee manipulated our ledgers." Trent's eyes darted toward me, silently pleading for me to play the compliant, broken wife. He still believed his forged documents held leverage. Gideon did not blink. He stepped closer, eliminating the physical distance, towering over the executive director. "You do not possess a single shred of documented proof," Gideon countered, his tone dropping to a glacial, terrifying register. "You possess a collection of forged signatures mapped to Delaware shell corporations. You engineered a fraudulent paper trail to frame my sister for your crimes. We currently hold the unredacted master ledgers detailing the theft of $5 million from underprivileged children. We possess the live transaction, hashes capturing your automated wire transfers, routing charity capital to the Cayman Islands." The air completely vanished from Trent's lungs. He stared at Gideon, his pupils dilating in pure, unmitigated horror, the realization that the federal government held the true, unfiltered data eradicated his final sliver of hope. "We also possess the forged applications you submitted to the Blackwood Disciplinary Academy," Gideon continued, leaning in, ensuring every syllable struck Trent like a physical blow. "You forged parental consent to incarcerate an 8-year-old boy in a remote lockdown facility to facilitate an emergency asset seizure." Trent's legs buckled. He grasped the edge of the mahogany table to keep from collapsing onto the Persian rug. The spilled bourbon soaked into his shirt cuff, staining the expensive white cotton. He possessed absolutely no defense. Cordelia finally found her voice. The matriarch pushed herself upright, gripping the armrests of her heavy wooden chair. She attempted to summon her patrician outrage, determined to wield her social influence against the federal intrusion. "How dare you invade my home?" Cordelia shrieked, pointing a manicured, trembling finger at Gideon. "Do you have any idea who I am? I host senators at this table. I will have your badge for this. I will call the mayor immediately and have this entire task force dismantled." Gideon slowly turned his head, fixing his cold, predatory gaze upon her. "The mayor vacated this premises 10 minutes ago." "Cordelia," Gideon stated, stripping away her final delusion. He fled out your front doors the moment he recognized the specific terminology surrounding a federal asset, freeze. Your elite associates abandoned you to save their own reputations. You possess zero political leverage. You are not an aristocrat. You are a common thief. Cordelia gasped, her hand flying up to clutch the stolen diamonds resting against her throat. The tactical officers closed the perimeter, cutting off any potential escape routes. Gideon lifted the thick stack of manila folders, holding the federal warrants in plain view. He delivered the execution order with lethal, uncompromising legal precision. "Trent and Cordelia," Gideon announced, his voice echoing over the ambient radio static of the tactical units. "You are both under arrest. You face federal indictment for massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering. You will also face severe penalty enhancements for the premeditated endangerment of a minor." Trent let out a choked, desperate sob. He abandoned his posturing, falling to his knees beside the mahogany table. He clasped his hands together, weeping openly, the tears carving clean tracks through the cold sweat coating his face. "Please," Trent begged, his voice rising in a pathetic, high-pitched wail. "It was not just me. Paige generated the procurement requests. She signed the invoices. Cordelia authorized the payouts. You have to offer me a deal. I will testify against all of them. Just do not put me in prison." He sold out his mother and his mistress in a matter of seconds, desperate to salvage his own freedom. Cordelia stared at her son, her face contorting in absolute disgust, realizing the man she had molded into her own narcissistic image possessed zero loyalty. Gideon lowered the warrants. He did not offer a deal. He offered a sharp, definitive nod to the tactical unit commander. "Execute the warrants," Gideon ordered. "Secure the targets." Two heavily armored tactical officers surged forward. They grabbed Trent by his upper arms, hauling him off the hardwood floor with zero regard for his bespoke tailoring. Trent thrashed weakly, his expensive dress shoes scrambling for traction against the Persian rug. The officers spun him around and slammed his chest forcefully onto the top of the mahogany table. The impact rattled the heavy oak furniture. The remaining crystal wine glasses toppled, shattering against the polished silver serving trays. "Hands behind your back," the tactical officer barked, pinning Trent's shoulders against the white damask tablecloth. Trent complied, weeping hysterically into the remaining artisanal stuffing. The sharp metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoed through the dining room, locking his wrists securely together. Simultaneously, two female FBI agents advanced on Cordelia. The matriarch attempted to pull away, shrinking back into her chair. But the agents moved with unyielding, mechanical efficiency. They grasped her arms, pulling her upright. Cordelia shrieked, kicking her expensive heels against the floor, demanding they release her. The agents ignored her protests. They forced her hands behind her back, snapping the cold steel cuffs securely around her wrists. The physical restraint violently terminated her lifelong reign of aristocratic supremacy. Sloane wailed from the opposite side of the table, burying her face in her hands as another agent stood over her, reading her Miranda rights for her complicity in receiving stolen charity funds. I stood calmly by the towering marble fireplace. I kept my hand firmly wrapped around Leo's small fingers. He stood quietly by my side, watching the chaos unfold with wide, unblinking eyes. He did not look terrified. He looked vindicated. He watched the woman who had slapped him, and the man who had ignored him, reduced to weeping, powerless figures, restrained by heavy steel. The tactical officers hauled Trent and Cordelia away from the mahogany table, dragging them toward the splintered front doors of the estate. The flashing red and blue strobe lights of the federal transport vehicles outside cast long, erratic shadows across the foyer walls. The dining room, once a monument to their suffocating arrogance, now lay in absolute ruin. The elite guests had vanished. The crystal lay shattered. The stolen millions evaporated into federal holding accounts. The trap had successfully neutralized the predators, and the execution had proceeded with flawless, terrifying precision. 4 hours elapsed between the violent breach of the mahogany dining room and the heavy steel door slamming shut behind me in the Federal Interrogation Center. The transition stripped away every remaining layer of their fabricated aristocracy. Gone were the crystal chandeliers, the imported cobblestone, and the deferential domestic staff. The architecture of accountability consisted entirely of cinder block walls, a scratched steel table bolted to the concrete floor, and harsh fluorescent tubes buzzing relentlessly overhead. The air inside the windowless room felt frigid, carrying the sterile, chemical scent of industrial floor wax and stale coffee. Trent sat on the opposite side of the steel table. The federal intake officers had stripped him of his leather belt, his silk tie, and the laces from his custom Oxford standard procedure to prevent self-harm in holding cells. His bespoke suit jacket hung limply over the back of the metal chair, wrinkled and deformed. The spilled bourbon from the Thanksgiving table had dried into a stiff, dark ring near the cuff of his white dress shirt. He did not look like the executive director of the Vanguard Hope Foundation. He lacked the posture of a man anticipating an imminent corporate promotion. He rested his elbows on the cold metal surface, burying his face in his trembling hands. Deep, rattling sobs tore through his chest, echoing off the bare concrete walls, the tears carved clean, jagged tracks through the cold sweat and grime coating his pale cheeks. His arrogant, untouchable facade lay completely obliterated, leaving behind a terrified, cornered animal. I sat directly across from him. My tailored black blazer remained immaculate. My posture remained perfectly straight. I folded my hands neatly on the tabletop and watched his psychological collapse with absolute, glacial detachment. Trent lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes locked onto my face, searching desperately for a trace of the quiet, compliant wife he had manipulated for 3 years. He searched for the fragile woman who apologized for misplaced keys and fabricated memory lapses. He found a concrete wall. "Willow, please," Trent begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic wheeze. He reached across the table, his fingers stretching toward my folded hands, but he stopped short of making physical contact, repelled by the freezing intensity of my stare. "You have to stop this. You have to speak to Gideon. Tell him to call off the prosecutors. Tell them this is a massive misunderstanding." I did not blink. I did not offer a single syllable of comfort. The silence amplified his panic. His survival instincts kicked into overdrive, overriding any lingering sense of familial loyalty. He scrambled to construct a defense, throwing the other members of his criminal syndicate directly onto the tracks. "It was not my operation." "Willow," Trent babbled, the words spilling from his mouth in a frantic rush. "Cordelia orchestrated the entire structure. She demanded the capital to fund the estate renovations and her Swiss wellness retreats. I just authorized the transfers because my mother forced my hand, and Page generated the phantom invoices. Page signed the procurement requests. They manipulated me. I can testify against them. I can hand my mother and Page to the Federal Bureau of Investigation on a silver platter. Just give me a plea deal. Please, you cannot let them lock me in a cage." He offered to sell out his own mother and his mistress in less than 30 seconds, desperate to salvage his own freedom. I observed his frantic pleading. I listened to the man who bought a $15,000 diamond necklace for his secretary attempt to paint himself as an innocent victim of circumstance. I reached down to the heavy leather tote bag resting beside my chair. I unzipped the main compartment and extracted a thick, heavy audit portfolio. It was bound in matte black, organized with pristine, color-coded tabs. I placed the portfolio flat on the scratched steel table. I pushed it forward. The heavy cardstock slid across the surface with a rough, grating scrape, stopping exactly 1 inch from Trent's trembling fingertips. Trent stared at the black binder. He recognized the physical manifestation of his doom. "Open it," I commanded, my voice slicing through his frantic babbling like a scalpel. Trent hesitated, his chest heaving, but the authoritative weight of the command compelled him to comply. He reached out with a shaking hand and flipped open the heavy cover. I did not let him interpret the data. I narrated his execution. Tab 1. I stated, pointing to the blue divider. Those are the live transaction hashes I captured directly from your automated scripts during the charity gala 2 weeks ago. I intercepted the data packets the exact second you routed the real estate magnate's $100,000 pledge into your Delaware shell companies. I possess the timestamps matching the deposits hitting your Cayman Islands portal. Trent's eyes widened, scanning the dense rows of digital forensic data. He realized I had monitored his active wire fraud in real time while standing in the same ballroom. Tab 2, I continued, pointing to the yellow divider. Those are the articles of incorporation for Apex Logistical Solutions and Summit Event Management. You will notice my forged digital signature resting on the registration lines. You will also notice the drafted emails you wrote to the white-collar crime division, attempting to frame me for your $5 million theft. The remaining color drained from his face entirely. His jaw dropped open. You encrypted that contingency folder with military-grade software, I said, leaning back in my chair. You assumed I possessed the technological capacity of a data entry clerk. I bypassed your firewall, cracked your encryption, and cloned your unredacted ledgers in exactly 10 minutes. Trent let out a choked, agonizing gasp. He grabbed the edges of the portfolio, his knuckles turning stark white. He realized his master plan, the intricate frame job designed to seize my assets and send me to a federal penitentiary, had been completely compromised before he even finalized the drafts. I reached across the table and flipped the portfolio to the final, red-coated tab. But the embezzlement and the forgery merely warranted a standard federal indictment, I whispered. The temperature in the room plummeting. This tab is why you will never breathe free air again. Trent looked down at the documents resting behind the red divider. They were the enrollment packets for the Blackwood Disciplinary Academy. You forged my signature to authorize the involuntary transport of an 8-year-old boy across state lines, I detailed, making certain every word struck him with concussive force. You checked the box authorizing solitary confinement. You checked the box authorizing physical restraints. You signed away his right to communicate with the outside world for 6 months. You planned to lock my son in a freezing, abusive reform camp in Wyoming just to ensure my brother could not block your emergency asset seizure in family court. Trent shrank back into his metal chair, pressing his spine against the cold backrest. He shook his head violently, attempting to deny the undeniable proof printed on the pages in front of him. I was not going to send him. Trent lied, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. It was just a contingency plan, Willow. I would never actually hurt Leo. I ignored the lie. I placed my hands flat on the steel table. I leaned forward, closing the physical distance between us until my face hovered mere inches from his. I stared directly into his terrified, bloodshot eyes. I channeled 3 months of suppressed rage, 3 months of silent observation, and 3 months of enduring his toxic manipulation into a single, lethal delivery. You spent the entire autumn attempting to convince me my mind was fracturing, I whispered softly, the quiet intensity of my voice echoing sharply off the concrete walls. You moved my keys. You intercepted my text messages. You diagnosed me with severe paranoia. You told me I was losing my grip on reality. I paused, letting the silence stretch, holding his gaze until he physically flinched. You are losing your grip, Trent. I deployed his favorite gaslighting phrase, throwing the weapon directly back into his chest. The psychological impact struck him with devastating accuracy. Trent recoiled, his breathing stalling completely. He stared at the apex predator sitting across from him, finally comprehending the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the trap he had walked into. He had attempted to hunt a ghost and found himself locked in a cage with a monster. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored black blazer. I retrieved the audit portfolio, snapping the cover shut and slid it back into my leather tote bag. And there will be no plea deals, I announced, looking down at his broken form. Gideon does not negotiate with child abusers. I did not simply hand this portfolio to the investigating agents. I submitted the unredacted master ledgers, the forged identity documents, and the Blackwood Academy contracts directly to the federal judge presiding over the grand jury. Trent let out a low, agonizing groan. He slumped forward, his forehead hitting the cold steel table with a dull thud. "Your offshore accounts are permanently seized," I concluded, ensuring he understood the absolute finality of his situation. "Your mother sits in an adjacent interrogation room, currently facing the exact same federal indictments. Paige surrendered to the authorities an hour ago. Your aristocratic illusion is completely eradicated. Your life as a free man is permanently over." I turned my back on him. I did not wait for a response. I did not linger to watch him weep. I walked toward the heavy steel door. Gideon stood on the other side, waiting in the observation corridor. He opened the door as I approached, his expression a mask of proud, unwavering solidarity. I stepped out of the interrogation room, leaving Trent trapped in the cold, windowless box, entirely consumed by the wreckage of his own catastrophic arrogance. The heavy steel door swung shut, the internal deadbolt sliding into place with a sharp, resounding click. The execution was complete, and my son was permanently safe. 6 months elapsed before the federal justice system delivered absolute, unmitigated closure. The heavy mahogany doors of the United States District Court swung shut, sealing the fate of the individuals who believed they possessed the authority to manipulate reality. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale apprehension. The presiding judge sat high on the bench, peering over his spectacles as he read the sentencing guidelines into the official record. He did not offer a single shred of leniency. His voice echoed through the cavernous room, striking the defendants like physical blows. He cited their flagrant abuse of philanthropic trust, the sheer scale of their international money-laundering network, and the sociopathic cruelty of their attempt to frame a federal auditor while permanently institutionalizing an 8-year-old child. Cordelia stood before the judge stripped of her emerald silk gowns and her stolen diamonds. The matriarch wore a standard issue, shapeless, khaki uniform. Her posture, once rigid with unearned aristocratic pride, sagged heavily under the crushing weight of a 30-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The woman who previously hosted mayors and appellate judges would spend the remainder of her natural life navigating cinder-block corridors. Entirely stripped of the social supremacy she worshipped, she would eat her meals off metal trays, sleep on a thin mattress, and answer to correctional officers who cared absolutely nothing for her fabricated lineage. Trent stood beside his mother, his wrists bound by heavy steel transport chains that clinked softly against his waist with every shuddering breath. The charismatic executive director wept openly as the judge finalized his 25-year sentence. My brother, Gideon, stood at the prosecutor's podium, watching Trent's collapse with cold satisfaction, having systematically dismantled their defense using the exact digital routing hashes I provided. Trent traded his bespoke Italian suits for coarse, abrasive cotton. He traded his leased European sports car for a barred transport bus. The federal government seized his offshore accounts, liquidated his physical assets, and successfully repatriated the stolen $5 million back to the domestic treasury. The man who attempted to orchestrate my ruin possessed absolutely nothing. Paige did not escape the federal blast radius. The grand jury indicted the 26-year-old event coordinator as a primary co-conspirator. During the trial, the prosecution projected her forged signatures and her fabricated procurement requests onto the massive courtroom monitors, permanently broadcasting her complicity to the public. She left the courthouse carrying a felony conviction that eradicated any possibility of future corporate employment. The high society elite who once admired her stolen jewelry now treated her as radioactive. She traded her designer dresses for the brutal reality of a ruined reputation, an insurmountable legal debt. Sloan absorbed the peripheral devastation, without the steady flow of embezzled charity capital sustaining her entitled lifestyle. Her financial reality collapsed inward with terrifying velocity. Federal marshals arrived at her luxury downtown penthouse, holding asset forfeiture warrants. They breached her front door, ordered her to vacate the premises, and towed her imported vehicles directly from the subterranean garage, stripped of the stolen funds that fueled her arrogance. The court forced her into immediate, total bankruptcy. Sloan vanished from the elite country clubs, exiled to a cramped, obscure apartment, completely isolated from the billionaires she once desperately tried to impress. The Vanguard Hope Foundation underwent a massive, brutal purge. The state attorney general dissolved the existing board of directors, replacing the negligent enablers with independent, ethical leadership. Treasury auditors scoured the remaining ledgers, ensuring the newly secured capital flowed directly to its intended targets. The impact was immediate. Pediatric oncology wards received their life-saving grants, allowing them to purchase vital medical equipment. Inner-city outreach programs secured their funding, building community centers and distributing winter coats to vulnerable families. The institutional rot was surgically excised, leaving behind a functioning, transparent organization that actually served the forgotten. I stepped out onto the wraparound balcony of my own serene estate. The late May sun warmed the flagstone patio, casting a golden hue over the property. A gentle spring breeze moved through the towering oak trees lining the perimeter, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine. I rested my hands on the wrought iron railing, looking down at the sprawling, vibrant green lawn. I had returned to my position at the Department of the Treasury, no longer hiding my elite expertise behind oversized cardigans and a submissive demeanor. I commanded my division with absolute authority, auditing corrupt enterprises without the suffocating weight of a toxic marriage dragging me down. Leo ran across the grass, chasing a golden retriever. He threw a tennis ball, his laughter ringing out, clear and entirely unburdened. He did not flinch. He did not minimize his presence to appease a cruel matriarch or an indifferent stepfather. He moved with the absolute, secure freedom of a child protected by an impenetrable fortress. He lived entirely free from their toxic, elitist shadow, surrounded by people who valued his intellect and his quiet strength. I watched him catch the ball, a profound, quiet peace settling over my chest. I did not merely survive the betrayal inflicted by Trent and Cordelia. I rejected the role of the victim. I weaponized my intellect. I deployed my silence as a tactical advantage, mapped their vulnerabilities, and completely dismantled their fraudulent empire. I ripped the false crown from their heads and handed them directly to the federal authorities, proving that true power resides in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The overarching lesson here is that you must never shrink your capabilities to comfort the fragile egos of toxic people. When manipulators mistake your silence for weakness and attempt to trample your boundaries, do not react with chaotic anger. Respond with cold, undeniable facts and flawless execution. True power is not about screaming the loudest. It is about holding the absolute truth and playing your hand exactly when the trap is locked. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you enjoyed this story of justice and resilience, please hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more. Stay strong, and I will see you in the next one.